I call this meeting to order. This is meeting number 124 of the Standing Committee on Finance. I want to welcome all of our witnesses here this morning. Colleagues, we have 6 organizations presenting this morning. We have the Canadian Labour Congress. We have the President, Mr. Ken Giorgetti. Welcome. We have from Fair Pensions for All, Senior Policy Advisor, Mr. Tom Charette. From the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, we have Mr. Brock Carlton, the CEO. From the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, we have the spokesperson, Mr. Ian Morrison. And from the Public Service Alliance of Canada, we have the National Executive Vice President, Mr. Chris Allward. We are expecting the Canadian Taxpayers Federation as well. You will each have up to 5 minutes for your opening statement, and then we will have questions from the members. We will start then with Mr. Giorgetti, please.
Thank you, Mr. Rajat. And committee, on behalf of the 3.3 million members of the Canadian Labour Congress, I want to thank you for the opportunity to present our views on Bill C-60, an act to implement certain provisions of the 2013-14 budget. CLC brings together workers from virtually all sectors of the Canadian economy in all occupations in all parts of Canada, including those working for Crown Corps. Crown corporations and their employees play a key role in providing Canadians with the services that the private sector is either unable or unwilling to provide. The 48 Crown corporations falling under federal jurisdiction operate in many key sectors of the Canadian economy, including transportation, energy, agriculture, fisheries, financial services, culture, and government services. As of December 31st, 2012, these entities employed 88,000 workers. Most of them are represented in members of the Canadian Labour Congress. A Crown Corporation is a distinct legal entity having a name, mandate, powers, and objectives set out by legislation or in articles of incorporation under the Canada Business Corporations Act. They're wholly owned by the state, but operate at arm's length from the government. As a result, Crown corporations are set up to operate under a, quote, corporate model, unquote, free of, and I quote again, of political interference on their ongoing activities, including labour relations and the collective bargaining process. The free collective bargaining process outlined in our Canada Labour Code, the code governing labour relations for federal Crown corporations, has worked extremely well for decades. This process allows both the employees and employers to sit down at a bargaining table, look at the needs of both parties within an organization, develop responses that satisfy both parties, and help build harmonious labour relations while achieving labour peace. These relationships have been developed over time between workers and employers in the federal sector. They're good ones, and they're underscored by the fact that almost all Crown corporations end up with settlements without a labour dispute between the parties, 99.7% of the time. Unfortunately, the proposed provisions in Division 17 of Part 3 of C-60, if passed, we fear will achieve exactly the opposite, more labour disputes. By having a third party enforcing a bargaining mandate through its presence at a bargaining table during all stages of negotiations, without an in-depth understanding of the ongoing challenges within the organizations, we say will be problematic. Furthermore, Treasury Board will have a veto on a tentative agreement. That degree of intervention by a third party will jeopardize the free collective bargaining process, allowing a third party to enact and dictate negotiations at all stages. In fact, we fear it will freeze collective bargaining because the employee side will wait for a decision of two parties instead of just one. Moreover, the bill specifies that Treasury Board is neither the employer nor an employer rep of the Crown Corporation, confirming its role as a third party without having any responsibilities over the success or failure of that process. For us, this proposed legislation will have an impact on the Crown Corporation's employer representatives to freely negotiate the terms and conditions of employment with the Crown's Corp and having the employees during the bargaining process. The section of the bill that gives Cabinet and Treasury Board the ability to impose the terms and conditions of employment on their employees without having to live with its consequences, it doesn't build a bargaining relationship necessary for ongoing relations after collective bargaining. It attacks the core corporate model of Crown Corps by allowing political interference in the ongoing business of arm's length organizations such as labor relations. We fear that this is more an aim or focus to try to change major terms and conditions of the agreement that the Crown corporations presently have with their employees. And I'm sure you're going to hear cries from others about the issue of pensions and other benefit programs that sit and reside within those programs. Anyone that sat at the bargaining table will know that if there is a third party's hands on bargaining, that it will freeze the process, and most of the time the employees will wait for two decisions to be made before they go back to their membership for any ratification or support for the process. That in itself, we think, will cause more disputes to happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Georgetti, for your presentation. We'll hear now from Mr. Charette, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and good morning, members of the committee, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Charette with Fair Pensions for All. We support the Section 229 amendment to the Act. The federal government needs to exert more control over the compensation levels and pension plans of the Crown corporations. The testimony to that is the bailout dollars that have had to flow to those corporations in recent years. We also support the intention of the government to ensure that the Crown Corporation pension plans are broadly aligned with those available to federal employees. But we strongly believe the government must go one step further. It must align the pension plans of both the Crown corporations and the federal employees with plans in the broad private sector for two reasons: fairness and financial sustainability. StatsCan numbers. Fairness first here. In 2011, there were nearly 17.5 million employed workers in Canada. About 20% or 3.5 million in the public sector, and nearly 80%, 14 million in the private sector. Almost all of these public sector workers have a guaranteed inflation-protected income from the first day of their employment through retirement and beyond the grave. Think about that. We're not saying they have guaranteed employment, although that is virtually the case. They have guaranteed lifetime income, and with the spousal benefit attached to their pensions, this income often continues beyond the grave. And these pensions are in the order of $30,000, $60,000, $100,000 a year and up. All the while, 10.5 million of the Canadian workers in the private sector have no employer-sponsored pension plan at all. Yet they have to contribute to the cost of these no worries for the rest of your life inflation-protected public sector pensions every time they pay sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes, buy a liter of gas, renew their driver's license, etc. Is that fair? It cannot possibly be fair for the federal government or any other government in Canada to use its power of taxation and spending to benefit what has become an economically elite group in our society. This differential treatment must be addressed. The biggest source of income inequality for Canadian seniors is determined simply by whether or not that person has worked in the public sector. The term pension apartheid really does describe the existing situation. Now, for sustainability, the real costs of these public sector pensions are only just now beginning to be realized. We must remember that these plans started modestly 40 years ago and reached their current form only about 10 years ago. We have really only just started to pay off on government promises to retiring public sector employees. And now, with many plans already in trouble, there are 5 things contributing to a perfect storm that is surrounding these plans. 1, a tsunami of baby boomers is beginning to retire. 2, public sector workers continue to retire earlier and earlier and with enhanced benefits. 3, life expectancies continue to increase. 4, we've had an extended period of very low rates of return on pension plan assets. And 5, the federal and provincial government finances are in a shambles across the country. The municipalities are stressed, and all levels of government are now ill-equipped to bail out public sector funds. Your predecessors in government have left you saddled with a huge fairness and sustainability problem. You and your contemporaries in the provincial capitals and municipalities have 3 choices: raise taxes, continue to bail out the plans and let the unfairness continue. 2, cut government staff and services brutally, keep bailing out the plans and let the unfairness continue, or fix the root problem: the over-generous public sector pensions. We strongly urge you to choose the latter course of action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I'll just apologize. There's something wrong with the English and audio. We're getting the French translation on the English audio. If we can get someone to look at that, please. Okay. Hopefully we'll address that issue very quickly. We'll move now to Mr. Carlton, please, for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. We really appreciate the opportunity to present to this committee. Au nom de quelques 2000 membres de la FCM, il me plaît.
On behalf of our organization, we are pleased to present our views on Bill C-60, in particular, Part 3, Division 18. We believe that the best way to create jobs and to strengthen our economic foundation for the future is to invest in municipal infrastructure. When federal, provincial, territorial, and local partners contribute, everyone brings forth their own share of expertise, and investments can only go further.
Canadians want to know that we're taking action to build the conditions for a competitive economy and strong communities. And Canadians want to know that all orders of government are working together to make progress on particular priorities: good roads, clean water, and a shorter commute. The new infrastructure plan announced in Budget 2013 is set to renew federal funding expiring in 2014. It will index the gas tax fund to protect its long-term value, and it provides longer-term funding for cost-shared projects. This is certainly a step in the right direction. By protecting the purchasing power of the gas tax transfer and by extending the program funding for 10 years, this budget advances the principle of long-term, predictable infrastructure funding. FCM is looking forward to getting on the work to design the new program, to plan it, and to ensure that municipalities do not miss a construction season in 2014, as has been committed to by this government.
We are particularly pleased with the government's decision to review the effectiveness of its infrastructure plan in the next 5 years. It will be an opportunity to measure how effective the plan was to fix the major gaps in infrastructure, including in public transit, and any improvements necessary following regulations on wastewater treatment.
Roadmap to erasing the infrastructure deficit. FCM would like to work towards a framework for achieving this important goal in the near term. Canada's municipalities own and operate 60% of Canada's core economic infrastructure, but collect just 8 cents of every tax dollar paid in Canada. This is one of the reasons why it is essential to ensure new, predictable infrastructure investments like the indexing of the Permanent Gas Tax Fund, which will add $9 billion over 20 years. I'd just like to give you a clear picture of why we believe investments that are predictable, like the Gas Tax Fund, are so essential to our work and to the country. Investments that are predictable allow companies to hire new workers and plan for new equipment that is needed. They allow business decisions on where to locate or upgrade based on planned public infrastructure. The gas tax allows for long-term planning with the flexibility for projects to be approved and funding dispersed in the same year. It also allows for the federal government to identify broad investment priorities while municipalities select the projects most needed. In addition, the ejection of private investment becomes easier to consider due to the access to a predictable revenue stream. Perhaps most importantly, every region receives their fair share, which means job creation across the country and more balanced economic outcomes. For Canadian municipalities, challenges will persist and remain a threat to Canada's economy and quality of life. These include the $20 billion price tag for meeting the new federal wastewater standards, growing traffic gridlock and inadequate public transit, and adapting municipal roads, bridges, and water systems to extreme weather caused by climate change. Meeting these challenges will require 1, further commitment by all orders of government, 2, a framework for cooperation, 3, better infrastructure management, including through sustained capacity building, and 4, new partnerships with the private sector where they make sense and where they benefit Canadians. An essential piece of this collaboration needs to focus on putting an end to offloading, whether it's the result of legislation shifting unfunded responsibilities onto local governments or municipalities having to fill the void when another government fails to fulfill its own frontline duties. Nous espérons que le plan à long terme.
Our hope is that the long-term plan announced in Budget 2013 can provide all governments with a model for common-sense cooperation and help tear down the silos that prevent them from delivering the very best value to taxpayers.
Expand the partnership, both with infrastructure and other challenges. Municipal leaders are ready to do their part. We are pleased to have this opportunity to talk, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from Mr. Morrison, please, for 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the chance to appear. 81 years ago, a Conservative Prime Minister introduced public broadcasting in Canada. 59 years later, a Progressive Conservative Prime Minister updated the Broadcasting Act for the 21st century.
229 of Bill C-60 would apply certain new provisions of the Financial Administration Act, FAA, to the CBC, giving the Cabinet the right to direct the Treasury Board that it must approve CBC's negotiating mandate for any collective agreement and impose any requirement on that mandate. Further, a Treasury Board employee might attend and observe the collective bargaining process. No collective bargaining could be entered into by the CBC without Treasury Board approval. The principal financial provisions relating to the CBC are set out in the Broadcasting Act, sections 52 to 70. They reflect a decision by Parliament to treat the CBC differently than other Crown agencies, subject to the FAA. In particular, the FAA's direction and control provisions do not apply to the CBC. In so doing, Parliament followed recommendations by the Common Standing Committee on Communications and Culture and the government's own policy paper entitled Canadian Voices, Canadian Choices, a New Broadcasting Policy for Canada. The Standing Committee's report expressed the nub of this issue succinctly, and I'm quoting, "The CBC should remain exempt from the power of direction provisions which are applicable to other Crown corporations under the Financial Administration Act, and from other provisions which would compromise the arm's-length relationship of the CBC to the government." Part 3 of the Broadcasting Act sets out the provisions of CBC's mandate within the Canadian broadcasting system. Each of these is outlined on page 2 of a letter of opinion by Brian MacLeod Rogers, one of Canada's most distinguished and renowned media lawyers, who is with me here today. Mr. Rogers back here. Friends has commissioned this opinion and has tabled the letter with the clerk of your committee this morning. Sections 35 and 52 of the Broadcasting Act are extremely clear in their direction that the CBC's editorial independence is an imperative that requires CBC to be treated differently than other Crown agencies. For example, Section 35(2) states that all the provisions of Part 3, quote, "shall be interpreted and applied so as to protect and enhance the freedom of expression and the journalistic, creative, and programming independence enjoyed by the corporation in the pursuit of its objects and in the exercise of its powers." The Broadcasting Act's fundamental requirement that CBC must maintain an arm's-length distance from government and be protected from possible governmental interference, as well as that the public should perceive that the CBC is independent, are not reflected in the C-60 proposals. Mr. Rogers' letter of opinion makes clear that there is a conflict between the carefully protected special status of the CBC under the Broadcasting Act and the proposed provisions of the FAA that seek to impose direct control by Treasury Board on all aspects of CBC's employment relations. After all, concludes Mr. Rogers, it is all too possible that government's levers of power, particularly its exercise of financial control, could be used in the future to shape, diminish, and even threaten the CBC's role as the public broadcaster. And the CBC's management and employees may find themselves affected in myriad and subtle ways in order to curry the government's favour or avoid its displeasure. Mr. Rogers concludes that the inherent conflict between the two statutes will require judicial determination to reconcile the apparent conflict between them. We recommend that the government steer clear of that morass by removing the CBC from Bill C-60, or failing that, making the clauses referencing CBC subject to the protection from interference afforded to Sections 35(2) and 52 of the Broadcasting Act. Monsieur le Président, j'ai aussi distribué aujourd'hui
Mr. Speaker, I have also distributed today, through the clerk, copies in both official languages of a letter to the Prime Minister on this matter signed by a number of Canada's most eminent authorities on democratic journalism, which they have copied to members of your committee. And I would like to add the name of Mr. Bernard de Rome, who signed the letter last evening. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison.
Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes.
Aylward? Yeah, for your 5-minute presentation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee members, for inviting me here today to share the views of the Public Service Alliance of Canada on Bill C-60. I had the pleasure of appearing before this committee last October on the previous budget implementation bill, one that continued cutting important public services that Canadians rely on, such as search and rescue, employment insurance, benefits and services for veterans, food inspection, border security, Canada's national parks, and scientific research, among others. We asked the government to change its decision on these cuts because we were already seeing the negative impact they were having on Canadian families, communities, and the economy. And we wanted the government to be more transparent and start listening to Canadians before making decisions on the programs and services they rely on. I am disappointed that the latest Budget Implementation Act did not heed these calls for caution. On the contrary, the cuts continue, and with the bill presently before the committee, the government is proposing to extend the damage to public services by adding unnecessary barriers to effective collective bargaining. Division 17 of the latest budget implementation bill will allow Treasury Board to unilaterally interfere directly in negotiations with Crown corporations and their unions. This is not a benign change, but one that could have profound consequences for labour relations in Crown corporations. The Public Service Alliance of Canada represents over 180,000 members. 5,000 of those members work at 19 different Crown corporations, including hard-working Canadians at the Bank of Canada, the Canadian Council for the Arts, Canada Post Corporation, and the Royal Canadian Mint, among others. Injecting a third party into the bargaining process isn't conducive to productive labour relations or collective bargaining. It removes effective control from the parties most directly affected, who know their workplace and the people who work there. The Act will require Crown corporations to get approval for their bargaining mandate from Treasury Board. It also will give Treasury Board Secretariat the authority to place one of its own employees at the bargaining table to attend and observe and presumably report back. This will effectively put a chill on any open and frank discussions the employer and the union could have at the table. Cabinet will have the ultimate authority over whether or not to interfere in the bargaining process, which would appear to be a further consolidation of power in the hands of the Prime Minister's office. The legislation specifically states that while it can interfere, Treasury Board is not the employer. They will have the power to dictate the mandate for bargaining and can be in the room overseeing the bargaining, but they wash their hands of any responsibility for having to be accountable for the implementation and responsibilities associated with the agreements or other terms and conditions of employment. The previous budget implementation bill imposed a similar arrangement with the Canada Revenue Agency, and I speak from personal experience. The CRA and the PSAC component, the Union of Taxation Employees, whose members work at CRA, have had a good working relationship in previous rounds of bargaining. Now, negotiations are dragging on, and the absence of a new contract, coupled with the continuing cuts to jobs and services, is creating a toxic environment, one that could be avoided. Employees and the public services they provide to Canadians suffer when the labour relations climate is undermined in this way. It does not lead to more effective delivery of public services, but rather leads to increased stress and conflict in the workplace. It also brings into question the integrity of the bargaining process and raises the question, who are we really bargaining with? The latest move affects our national museums and the CBC, among others. It could signal an end to the independence of our national cultural institution. Is this just another way of seeking control over independent institutions that work on behalf of Canadians and not the government of the day. I'll conclude, Mr. Chair, by saying that this new provision will just compound a worsening problem. I recommend that this committee strike Division 17 from the bill and send the government a message that it should honour the collective bargaining rights of the members of the Federal Public Service. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. We'll begin members' questions with Ms. Nash for 5 minutes, please. Sorry.
Just, Mr. Chairman, would you indicate to me at what time it would be appropriate to ask for unanimous consent to be able to ask questions in one of the rounds? I just wanted to signal my interest in that consensus test, but I'll wait till you have a proper moment.
Okay, you can ask for it now if you wish.
Entirely up to you, Mr. Chair. I didn't want to interrupt the flow, but neither did I want to interject when you're running out of time.
Okay. Does Ms. May have unanimous consent to, sorry, Ms. Nash on this point?
Mr. Chair, our committee has agreed to rules about the representation on the committee and who gets to speak when. As you know, we have very limited time, but based on your letter inviting amendments from other members of Parliament, if one of the Conservative members on the committee would like to donate their time and have this member substitute in, we would be quite willing to do that, which is, of course, according to our rules.
You're saying only if the Conservatives gave up their time?
Unless another party would like to give up their time. But those are the rules that we've all agreed to as members of this committee.
Yes, you're right. We do have a schedule in front of me that I am obliged to follow. Ms. MacLeod on this point?
I was going to say, alternatively, we would provide consent if one of the opposition members were willing to give up one of their slots, but certainly we have a very short time frame in terms of even all our members will not have an ability to get a question into this particular panel. So again, I think if Ms. May wants to find someone that's willing to provide a slot.
Thank you, Ms. MacLeod. Mr. Bryson, do you want to give up your slot to Ms. May?
Oh, as a Liberal, it's instinctive for me to want to give. But as a pragmatist, I only have one round, so I'm unable to do that. But I would suggest the Conservatives, who have a liberal quantity of opportunities today to ask questions, ought to consider this.
Ms. May, I think you've had your answer from the three parties, so I will follow the list as prescribed, and I will continue with Ms. Nash, please. Your time starts now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to all the witnesses. I regret that we have such limited time with you before this committee. Mr. Giorgetti, you said, I believe, that you represent, is it 3.3 million Canadian workers?
Correct.
And I presume that means your organization, through those members, is involved in negotiating thousands of collective agreements, and that those workers are represented by thousands of collective agreements across Canada. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is my understanding correct that policy decisions at the Canadian Labour Congress are taken at a convention with thousands of members present, and that in fact that's where you are elected as president of the CLC? Is that correct?
Yeah, 3,000 delegates at a convention, yeah. Okay,
thank you. Mr. Charette, it sounds like you represent 10 times that many people, because you're advocating fair pensions for all. So it sounds like you represent 34.5 million Canadians. Is that the membership of your organization?
No, it's not. And as far as representing, it may be better to say representing workers in the private sector, which are about 14 million and a little bit more this year.
Okay, and so you have 14 million members in your organization?
No. I said we have perhaps 800.
You represent about 800 people. And how do you decide the policy for your organization?
We have formed the organization about 8 months ago as a nonprofit, and we're slowly gathering momentum, lots of interest in what we're doing, particularly as people find out the disparity between the public and private sector.
Okay, but no convention where your policies are voted on and adopted. I just wanted to clarify that. I have to move on because I have such little time. To Mr. Morrison, now, I understand from the Canadian Media Guild, maybe you can help clarify this, that the collective agreement at the CBC is not just about wages and benefits, but that it contains clauses to help ensure journalistic integrity for Canada's largest journalistic organization that includes strict conflict of interest rules that ensures that CBC journalists act in the public interest, that journalists are protected from political interference with their work, and to ensure that journalists don't have to fear retribution for stories that they may cover, that may cover politicians of the day, and that the Treasury Board's interference could undermine these measures. Is the CBC's independence based on these kinds of collective agreement provisions essential to its performance as a journalistic entity?
I would put it this way. The statutory basis for the CBC's independence enables collective bargaining that creates conditions of work that defend the autonomy of journalists. For example, a journalist cannot be just pulled off a story without a reason. A producer has the right to refuse to produce something if for some reason they feel they're being pressured. There are a whole range of examples. You'll find a list contained in the letter to the Prime Minister that has been circulated this morning, yes, that are the practical expression of the journalistic independence. And the threat to that is that if the government of the day controlling a Treasury Board employee gets into the position of approving such matters, there's a danger of interference and a collapse of the whole basis of the independence.
Mm-hmm. So while we have a public broadcaster, its integrity and independence has been assured by this arm's length entity, and it has been not only in its collective agreement, but in the statutes controlling that entity.
And I would add one thing, Ms. Nash, and that is we know of no other national public broadcaster in any Western democracy, any OECD country, that has any provisions where the government of the day can interfere in the conditions of work of its journalists.
Very important. Mm-hmm. Now, as I understand it, this new attack on the CBC comes after significant budget cuts over the years by both successive Liberal and Conservative governments. I have been contacted by thousands of constituents in my riding over the years about these cuts. Can you tell me what impact this has had on the CBC?
Just a brief response, Mr. Morrison.
What impact the cuts have had on the CBC?
Well, when you get cuts, what you get is a decline in what is called production values. And it happens particularly, Ms. Nash, in smaller centres, not so much in your constituency, but in rural Alberta, for example, or northern British Columbia, or rural Newfoundland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Nash. Ms. McLeod, please, for your round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And not a question, but I do want to just note that recently, in the last year, CBC has opened a new outlet, a radio outlet in Kamloops. So certainly, as they continue to receive close to $1 billion a year, $1 billion a year, and we see, certainly the service being expanded and really being focused. But I really want to start by focusing in perhaps with Mr. Charette and Mr. Giorgetti. And I guess there's two examples I want to provide for you. And, the first, of course, is I think just last week in the supplementary estimates A, we saw Via Rail request an additional $99 million from the federal government to address the solvency of pension plans. So certainly that was coming to the Canadian taxpayers to deal with a solvency of pension plan issue. I look at, the recent report by the Conference Board of Canada, who is looking at, by 2020, $1 billion a year deficit with Canada Post. Of course, mostly we recognize that the way Canadians do business is changing, so that it's really having a significant impact on the business model. I also look at, the current agreement with Canada Post, and as I understand it, even if they're making adjustments in terms of efficiencies, they actually do not have any ability to lay off most companies, whether it be my mills or wherever. If they do have adjustments that they have to make, they have the ability to adjust the workforce, it's very difficult, but they do have that ability. Canada Post doesn't. I contrast that with perhaps when you're back home and you visit the small businesses in your riding who pay their 11% tax. They work very, very hard. So yes, absolutely, we need to value the public service and the work that they do, but I visit these small businesses who are putting considerable time, energy, effort, and actually do not have the benefit of the pension plan. So I guess, to my mind, the government saying we have to look at the taxpayers' ability to pay is a very important feature of this budget. And I'll look to, again, I'll start with Mr. Giorgetti, and then I'll let Mr. Shred, if you could keep it somewhat brief so that there's an opportunity for both to speak.
Mr. Giorgetti, please start.
Well, you're correct. At least 65% of Canadians don't have a pension plan. But taking pension plan away from the other Canadians isn't going to help those Canadians without a pension plan, is my first point. My second point is that the Canada Pension Plan expansion that we are advocating for would solve a lot of these solvency deficiencies that exist because of a market meltdown that started to happen in the United States, and that disease seems to have traveled around the world. Those plans were based on certain market assumptions that no longer exist, and that's part of the problem. We do have to revisit our entire pension scheme, but if you would take a look at the CLC's proposal to expand the Canada Pension Plan, it would do a heck of a lot to give people who don't have a pension plan a secure pension, a retirement future, and it would also take a lot of burden off pension plans that exist today. But taking pensions away from existing workers will not help those workers that don't have a pension plan one iota.
So, Mr. Charette, please.
I would disagree with that last statement. After all, if a particular Crown corporation needs to have an injection of $99 million, or somebody else needs $1.2 billion, where's that money going to come from? It's going to come from all taxpayers, including the huge group that don't have these pensions, and that's less they have available for saving for retirement. They're paying for these pensions. Second, in terms of not taking away, you have to remember that the proposal that the CLC is making vis-a-vis Canada Pension Plan is going to impact mostly small employers. 70% of business units in the country have less than 5 employees. They don't have these public sector type pensions themselves, the owners don't, and they have no prospect ever of having such a pension plan. And if you do those proposals that they're suggesting, you're going to cause the owner of those small little units of business, they will pay double the increase everybody else because they're thought to be both an employer and an employee, and then they'll pay half of whatever the increase is for their employees, and they don't have a pension themselves. This is absolutely ethically wrong.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. McLeod. Mr. Bryson, if you're around.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance appeared before the committee, and I quoted excerpts from the letter we've received from Hubert Lacroix, the president of CBC, where essentially the president of CBC threatens to sue the government if the budget bill C-60 passes as it is. And in that letter, he also said that the budget bill would reduce the independence that is critical to our operation, and that it could potentially embroil the government, our corporation, and its unions in litigation, a result that could be avoided with an amendment that protects that independence. So I simply ask the Minister, would you support an amendment to your budget bill that protects the independence of the CBC so that we can avoid a court battle between the government and the CBC? And the Minister responded, the CBC may think that it's a special part of a Crown agency. That is wrong, or rather this is wrong. All the Crown agencies have a responsibility through ministers back to Parliament, to the people of Canada. Do you disagree, or would you agree or disagree with the Minister that the CBC is distinct from other Crown corporations?
Mr. Bryson, it doesn't really matter what I think. That's the law of the land, as I've quoted in my presentation, and there are good reasons for it, and it was, of course, under Mr. Mulroney's government that those reasons were advanced into law.
Yes.
But more important
that
than
was a progressive conservative government. It's quite distinct.
Oh, you're even more familiar with it than I am, sir. But I just want to say that the government has ample control over the national public broadcaster. I use the word control advisedly, influence, through control of the amount of public funds it receives. Something like 70% of its revenues come from the Canadian taxpayer, and also through total control of appointments of its board of directors and its chief executive officer. And the arm's length principle, as I mentioned previously to Ms. Nash, is pretty important, and you cannot find an example in another free and democratic country of any proposition like the one that the Bill C-60 would have on the CBC. It's just not acceptable.
Thank you very much, and thank you for helping familiarize the government members with the law of the land on this issue. I think it's particularly important and helpful to edify all members of Parliament, and I'll make sure that the message gets back to the Minister as well as part of this ongoing pedagogy. I also have a question with regards to, in general, the government's attitude not just to public broadcasting, but to organized labor, and whether it is C-377 or some of the changes proposed in the Budget Implementation Act, do you see an ideological vendetta on behalf of this government against organized labor and pitting the majority of Canadians and trying to pit the majority of Canadians against the interests of organized labor? Mr. Giorgetti.
We're a bit curious as to why a successful process of collective bargaining and the legislation that allows workers to organize and bargain collectively is not seen as a positive aspect of the economy and society.
Yes, has there been some sort of ongoing labor unrest that has precipitated this significant shift by the government? I haven't been aware of some significant. And furthermore, do you look at, for instance, models like Germany, where you have an active, engaged companies and government with organized labor as partners in progress, and a robust economy? Should we not be looking at some of those models as inspiration, as opposed to trying to pick a fight, if you will, with organized labor gratuitously?
We would hope that that would be the case. We would think that our advice on industrial relations and collective bargaining matters, on unemployment insurance and pension reform, would be sought out by any government of the day. But unfortunately, it seems that our opinions are not valued enough by this government, frankly.
Mr. Aylward, as a
10 seconds,
appreciate
Mr.
your
Bryce.
view from the public service.
Mr. Aylward, briefly on that point, then.
Well, not to reiterate what's already been said, but it's very obvious that this government has shown nothing but disdain and contempt for working families and workers in this country, unionized or non-unionized. From the day they received a majority government, what they did to the hard-working men and women of the Canada Post Corporation when they forced them out on the street, only for a couple of weeks later to force them back to work. Okay. And it just continues from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Van Kesteren, for your round, please.
Thank you all for coming here. Of course, I got to carry on with that line. I take exception. I'll tell you why I take exception. Because not only do I represent those people you're talking about, a lot of these people are my friends too. There's a big difference, and I want to challenge you on this. There's a real big difference. The difference is that in another collective bargaining situation, there is competition. And I think Canadians recognize, I know we do, and I think I can speak for the government, recognize the good work that our public services does. And we see that here I think in this office time and time again, the excellent work that they do. However, somebody has to be at the table to say yes or no. Now, case in point, I think Mrs. McLeod was talking about the fact that, and you mentioned, Mr. Allward, you mentioned the post office, so we'll carry on with that one. The fact that you have a collective bargaining agreement that employees cannot be laid off. Now, that's great if you have a situation where there's competition. If a company, if General Motors wants to do that and they want to go up against Chrysler and the rest of the Detroit 3 and the Japanese, that's a different situation. But when there's no competition, I kind of think Mr. Charlotte's got the right, the right attitude. Somebody has to come in and say, wait a minute, we're the people that are making the payments. We're the people that are paying those salaries. We're the people that are paying for those pensions, especially when they don't have those benefits or don't have those same salaries. And now I'm going to let you respond to that. But I just want Mr. Charlotte, just if you would just maybe elaborate on that theme.
Well, yeah, you're very right. We will hear some say, well, it's not a matter that we've got contracts that are too rich in the public sector. It's that they're not good enough in the private sector. And go and tell your boss, if you're in the private sector, you want a better deal. But you've put your finger on the precise problem. The boss in the private sector has got competition. It may be foreign competition. It may be competition down the street. But nevertheless, they're constrained by that competition. The public sector unions, at least, are dealing with employers that are monopolists, mostly, and have not customers, but taxpayers funding the revenue they collect.
And I'm just going to cut in, and I just take exception also to what Mr. Bryson said, to insinuate that, geez, this is something new. I would suggest that formative past governments have just not stood up to what they should have done, and now we're in a situation where, because we are taxed, we are taxed to the limit. I think Mr. Giorgetti, you mentioned yourself just what shambles finances have become in most Western governments' finances, and so now we must react. Is it something we want to do? Absolutely not. As I said, these are my friends. These are my colleagues, and often cases people that I live beside. It's not, but it's something that we must recognize, and it's just something that has to be done. So how do you respond to that? I'm just curious. I'm going to ask Mr. Eller.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the time allowing me the time to respond. Let's just look at putting somebody at the table to be able to say yes or no, as you put it. When you do that, that simply puts a drag on the whole process.
But doesn't that have to be done?
And it doesn't allow for the process to carry on naturally. When we look at the Canada Revenue Agency that was created in 1999, 5 rounds of very successful bargaining. I sat on the bargaining team in 2007 and 2010. In 2007, 6 days at the bargaining table, face-to-face negotiations, we reached the tentative agreement. In 2010, 5 days of face-to-face at the bargaining table. Last year, this government put in the 2012 budget. The CRA must now get a bargaining mandate from Treasury Board. We started negotiating last October. The Union of Taxation Employees did, which is a component of the PSEC. Last October, after 8 weeks of face-to-face negotiations at the bargaining table, they're still without a deal. That's costing taxpayers money. So I don't know how you would explain that.
Well, I would by saying that that's the previous government just allowed, and as Mr. Charette has pointed out, the previous government has allowed for negotiations that just aren't acceptable. And so at some point, the government has to.
And what this government wants to do is a race to the bottom, which we're not interested in at all. I mean, what we're trying to do is protect working families in this country, protect the middle class, and not enter into a race to the bottom.
We'll have to have this as an ongoing debate. I do have to move on. Monsieur Caron, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais commencer avec Monsieur Charette.
Mr. Caron. Mr. Charette, just quite quickly.
I've been on your website. I've seen what you've had to say. I've looked at the various documents that you've produced. So you represent fair pensions for all. I didn't find a single document that shows that you advocate for economic safety or better retirement for children. Could you tell me if you have come up with a document, if you've spoken to this at all, in terms of improving the economic security for pensioners?
Two questions. One has to do with children. The other has to do with pensioners.
Non, j'ai demandé pour... Non, vous n'avez pas compris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On your website, and basically I haven't seen any documents that showed any presentation or any public policy document showing that you were actually advocating for better economic security or better retirement conditions for our seniors. So have you ever produced a document showing this, given that your name is Fair Pensions for All?
Well, my presentation this morning is part of that. It says, look, we do want fair pensions for all, and it's extremely unfair at the moment. So you've got to fix the ones.
If you actually ever produce a document or made a presentation to improve economic security for our seniors. Because all the documents I've seen are actually advocating decrease in pensions for either government employees, officials, crown corporations, or any other such organization. So I've never seen a document actually asking to increase or improve pension conditions for anybody.
Okay, Mr. Charette, please respond.
We're trying to help the people that don't have pensions, basically the 11 or 10.5 million Canadians that don't have pensions at all.
I don't get the link. I don't get the link between helping Canadians to help pensions. I don't see how advocating against pension security for anybody that you decide that you are going to go against is actually improving their conditions. Their pension condition won't be improved.
What we're asking is to solve the unfairness. Now, if you want to solve it, if you think you can solve it, by making the kind of public sector pensions that are available to public sector workers, to all workers, coming out of all taxpayer funds, that's fine.
This won't be happening. This is not what we're discussing. We're discussing basically looking at those who were able to get better pensions and just bringing them down. That's what you're advocating. And I'd like to actually mention about your CPP comments that the arguments that you presented were the exact same arguments about the sky falling when the CPP was initially introduced. Those were the same exact arguments. I'd like to go to Mr. Morrison now. On a entendu hier le ministre.
Yesterday, we heard from Minister Flaherty, and he said something in response to my colleague's question from Ms. Nash. She asked if the provisions on Crown corporations would have a negative effect on Canada Post, Radio-Canada, CBC, on the Investment Bureau, Pension Investment Bureau. These are all organizations who, by definition, have to be at arm's length. And she gave examples in how journalists, reporters, researchers for the Bank of Canada, for example, could be affected. The answer was...
Ça, c'était sa réponse mot pour mot. Est-ce qu'on a besoin d'entrer...
That was his response. So are we going to end up in a dictatorship in terms of the impact on the arm's length nature of information at CBC?
Is throughout the world accompanies democracy. There are no free and democratic countries without public broadcasters. Some are stronger, some are weaker, but that is the case. And so my answer to you is that I think I would urge the minister to reflect on this matter. I do not ascribe any motive to the government. Others can do that. I'm just concerned with the result. And an unfortunate result, as is described in the rather articulate letter to the Prime Minister that has been circulated, the result is the threat of losing something very important in the democratic fabric of Canada, not instantly, but gradually, and we will live to regret it. It's unnecessary, and it's also undesirable.
Merci, Monsieur Caron.
Thank you, Mr. Caron.
for being here today. I know you're all very busy within your respective organizations, so we really appreciate your time here today. Mr. Giorgetti, I don't think anybody would disagree with the fact that one person out of work is one too many in this country. So I think we're all on the same page there. But I do just want to take a second to Mr. Bryson had mentioned earlier, criticizing our government in terms of our relationship with Labour. It was his party that introduced wage and price controls, and it was his party that downloaded services in the 90s, which caused a huge pinch for provincial governments in their collective bargaining with trade unions, and it was his former leader that reopened collective bargaining agreements in Ontario that were fairly and equitably negotiated. Mr. Carleton, the gas tax fund, we've made it permanent, we've indexed it. How important is that for cities in this country to have now the ability to be able to rely upon stable and consistent funding?
Well, you've almost answered the question. It's extremely important, and the predictability of it, the long-term nature of it, is what is essential as part of the solution to the municipal infrastructure deficit.
Thank you. How important would you say our cities are to our country's economy?
Oh, I think there's no question that the cities and towns in this country, whether the big cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, etc., or the smaller towns in the rural areas, they are the engines of the economy. They're the place where Canadians are employed. They're a place where production is most significant. They're the places where there's creativity and innovation in the economy. The strength of the municipal sector, the capacities in the municipalities, and the infrastructure that is the foundation for the operations within a municipality are essential to the economic viability of this country.
Are there any cities, in your estimation, that we give the money to the cities and they spend it as they see fit? Are there any cities, in your estimation, that are spending their money wisely, and let's just assume they all do, but more wisely than others? And which city or cities would that be, and what sort of things are they doing that would be of value for us to hear?
I don't think I could characterize one place over another. Every city or town is dealing with their local priorities and their local demands in ways that fit with the needs in their communities. So they are all following democratic process and due diligence with respect to the way their money is spent and responding to local priorities.
Mm-hmm. In terms of engines of job creation, cities are significant, correct?
Yes.
The infrastructure needs of cities, how critical is it right now? And we all know about what we can see in terms of what's above the city, but what about what's beneath the city? The infrastructure that's lying under the roads, under the buildings. A lot of that was built, some of it's 50, 60, 75 years old. What's the lifespan of that, and how important is that to start to think about replacing all that underground infrastructure?
Yeah, if you want to talk specifically the below grade infrastructure, a lot of that relates to water and sewerage. You're correct. Some of the infrastructure is much older, in fact, than what you're indicating. If you look at, for example, in the city of Montreal and some of the other older cities in the country, some of the water pipes are wood.
Really?
Yeah. So in order for quality of life that Canadians expect, in order for the kinds of quality communities where investors want to put their resources so that we create jobs and productivity in this country, that kind of infrastructure is essential. So whether it's the water systems and sewerage systems underground, whether it's the road systems at grade, those are the foundations of the economy and the productivity in our cities and communities.
30 seconds.
Oh, 30 seconds? Okay. I'm good.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Adler. Mr. Rankin, for your round.
Thank you. I guess I'd first like to ask a question of Mr.
First of all, I really appreciated your commentary, sir, on the impact of the cuts and your experience with the Canada Revenue Agency in particular. As critic and as a member of Parliament for Victoria, I have so many people daily coming into my office and complaining about the impact of those cuts on their lives. So I can only tell you that I appreciate very much what you're saying. The issue of one of the groups that you represent, I wanted to focus on the Bank of Canada employees. And I want to give you a scenario and ask if you think this is realistic in light of the proposed amendments in C-60. A Bank of Canada economist, let's say, publishes some kind of research paper that concludes that current government fiscal policy is inadequate in some fashion. The Treasury Board orders that her salary be cut in half. Is that the kind of possible arrangements that could be in place, the kind of changes that could be made as a consequence of Bill C-60 in your view?
That's exactly what we refer to when we talk about the unilateral interference by Cabinet. Yes.
I guess then for either yourself or Mr. Giorgetti, both of you have enormous experience in collective bargaining, and Mr. Giorgetti spoke in particular, I think he used the expression that the impact of C-60's changes would be to, quote, freeze collective bargaining. I think you indicated that there would be two decisions, a Treasury Board decision and the person at the negotiating table, and it might be hard to have two separate decisions. It might slow things down, or you use the term freeze that. I'd like to hear both of you to talk a little bit about what the dynamic would be if this change were implemented vis-a-vis Crown corporations.
Well, my experience, I've had this experience, and what it does for the management side negotiators is freeze their ability to be able to make compromises at a bargaining table because they have to look over their shoulder and wait for permission from someone else. And if that someone else doesn't have the responsibility for the outcome, as my friend from the PSAC says, productivity and morale start to suffer because you're dragging bargaining on and people don't have a settlement. The effect of it is profound. The great effect of collective bargaining is you get it done, you get it ratified, you get over. We do that about 96.7 or 96.8% of the time, and we get good settlements. The longer bargaining goes on, you've seen it yourselves, all of you, the less productive it is. It has an effect in the workplace, but it also has an effect in the outcome of productivity going forward after the agreement, because the employer side doesn't take responsibility for the outcome anymore. Someone else decided for them, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Just to add to what Mr. Giorgetti just said, in respect to it has a tremendous trickle-down effect, a very detrimental trickle-down effect. And there's nothing worse, and I speak from experience, there's nothing worse than sitting at a bargaining table, having to listen to, we have to check back with our principals, and literally waiting for days at the bargaining table for the employer to come back and respond to simple bargaining demands, very simple bargaining demands.
Well, again, to yourself, sir, could this Treasury Board change the bargaining mandate entirely of a Crown corporation and perhaps force it to engage in regressive bargaining, force it to even violate existing labor law? And if so, what recourse would you have if the Treasury Board were the real decision maker?
The only real recourse that we would have, of course, would be through the bargaining process, and depending on what the dispute settlement route may be, that would certainly be one. But even in the current process, where Treasury Board is involved, and I'm going to speak to a specific group, our technical services members, who are members of PSAC, known as TC members, they went through bargaining last year, reached impasse. They went through a public interest commission. That Public Interest Commission report was produced in January. We're supposed to receive a response within 30 days of the report being produced. We've yet to receive a response from Treasury Board.
Okay. About 30 seconds.
A quick question then for Mr. Morrison. A scenario, let's say a CBC journalist is writing a story on the Senate scandal, and the Treasury Board orders that journalist to be moved from full-time to part-time. Is that a possible scenario as a consequence of Bill C-60?
I think it's a bit far-fetched, but it doesn't require that scenario to be accurate for all of the concerns I have expressed to be valid.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rankin. Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses that appeared today. Mr. Charette, I agree with everything you said. I think option 3 is fair. I especially think that is important because the people that pay for public service pension plans usually make a lot less money than the people receiving it. They also receive a lot fewer benefits and have a lot less job security. So it seems to me that the people paying for things for other people should at least receive the same benefit as the people that receive it. So I congratulate you today for that, because I think your motive, like the government's motive, is for fairness. And I certainly think that's a good place to start. Mr. Allward, I have had the opportunity of hearing your testimony before, and I would say that in relation to bargaining, I, as many lawyers in this country have done, continuously represent our clients by having to go back and forth to the clients to assure that when we're at the bargaining table, the client itself is consistent with our negotiation. And that is very normal. It happens with all lawyers in Canada, with all lawyers, I believe, in any democracy, and that is that when they negotiate with another lawyer, they have to go back to the person that's actually paying the bill, which in this particular case is the taxpayer of Canada, to assure themselves that they are meeting with the designation and theme and requirement and ability to pay of the client itself. So I would disagree with you, because I think it's definitely possible, because every day thousands of lawyers do it, and they do it effectively, and they do it to the best interest of the client, as we are going to do for the best interest of Canadian taxpayers.
But I did say for days.
Now, Mr. Morrison, I have had the opportunity of reading your letter. I noticed that out of the 13 people that signed the letter, 8 were journalists, mostly with CBC, 4 were academics, and 1 was an American journalist. I'm not sure if they get CBC in Oregon, but I'm not sure why they would have signed it. I just...
Canadian journalist who's working in Oregon.
In Oregon, yeah. I went down to Oregon for a while and did a Bachelor of Science degree there. It's a beautiful city. It's fantastic. I wasn't really sure why he signed it in that particular place. But what I was interested...
Endeavor to find out and get back to
what I'm interested in is in particular whether or not... I watch CBC. I watch it every day. I watch it a lot. Do you watch CTV and Sun Media?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I do as well. I watch them, all 3 of them. I watch them in Quebec for the most part, because that's where I live when I'm in Ottawa doing the people that I represent's business in Northern Alberta. And I watch all 3, Channel 18, 63, and 79, and I do not discriminate between any of them. I try to watch them all because I want to know what's going on. I notice there's no friends of CTV or Sun Media here today, but I'm just wondering if you...
here today either. We are an
Mr.
independent
Morrison, this is my
organization.
This is my opportunity to ask questions, and I don't have
appropriate,
Mr. Morrison, I said a particular statement in relation to CTV and Sun. It had nothing to do with your appearance here today. What I'm asking is, do you oppose the same funding for CTV and for Sun Media per capita as CBC receives?
Yes.
And why do you oppose it?
They are private television networks. They compete with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, whose English language network is 60% funded by advertising. But they have nothing to do with public radio, such as, for example, the station that Ms. McLeod referred to a few minutes ago.
I have public radio by CBC up in Fort McMurray in that area as well, so I understand. Now, would you suggest on a per-watcher basis for TV alone, on public broadcasting for CBC, should that be treated equally between CBC, CTV, and Sun? Should they receive the same money per capita? For instance, I don't listen to CBC radio, but I watch all 3 of the channels on an equal basis. Should each of them receive equal funding for what I watch because I am a taxpayer?
No.
So CBC should be treated distinctly different, even though they have the same carriage of the same product for the same people.
The difference is that one of the principal differences, Mr. Jean, is that in prime time they are delivering Canadians Canadian programming, whereas the other networks you mentioned are buying Hollywood programming and wrapping Canadian ads around them.
I guess
that's where their revenue is.
The difference is I only watch news pretty much because that's what I need to keep track of. Mr. Carlton,
you have that in common with many politicians.
Very quickly, are you confident in relation to the government? You've been with the Canadian FCM for a long time. You've seen what's happened. You've negotiated with the government. Are you confident with the government position on an ongoing basis of a positive outcome for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities?
Very briefly, Mr. Carlton. Thank you.
We believe that Budget 2013 has established a new base camp for a good relationship. It's a productive discussion between the municipalities and the Government of Canada around the needs of communities.
currently?
As I said in my commentary, the solutions for the infrastructure deficit are not in place at the moment, but the progress has been noticeable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Monsieur Côté, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm very pleased for you that my colleague, Mr. Hadner, did not ask you questions on your political affiliation, because it seems that there may already be some issues in that regard. That being said, I have a question for you, Mr. Carlton, with regard to borrowing costs of the federal government. These are significant. Take the Muskrat Falls power project in Labrador. The federal government advanced loan guarantees, which would allow Labrador and Newfoundland to save a lot of money. And this is not necessarily a good thing. Can you please tell us about the impact of the savings that will be made and what effect this would have on municipalities, especially as far as shared programs are concerned? I'm not sure I completely understood the question through the interpretation. I think you asked a question on cost-sharing programs. Yes. Yes, shared cost programs, but especially the presence of the federal government and what kind of savings this would represent for municipalities, since it would mean that proportionally you would have to borrow less if the federal government participates.
If they need it, with the gas tax, the long-term and predictable funding nature of the gas tax will allow them to borrow in the market in a longer term, because they have stable, predictable funding against which to borrow. So that is, in fact, a strong advantage. I don't understand the reference to in Newfoundland and Labrador with respect to the municipal context, so I can't really respond to that.
That's fine. I was just using that as an example because there would be savings of $1 billion for the province, so I was just giving that as an example. In my riding, I have 2 private community centers which have managed, and I congratulate them, to get money under the community infrastructure program. And of course, this makes life a lot easier for these 2 centers. It helps them deal with their financial situation when they have access to funding from other participants. Can you talk to the participation of the federal government with regard to projects going ahead?
As you know, in the Building Canada Fund program, the expectation is that there's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 cost sharing. This is a really important opportunity for municipalities to leverage their dollars to do larger pieces of work. The problem is that with program funding, one has to invest a lot of money in preparing your program proposal, and then one has to wait and see if you are lucky and happen to get a project selected. Ça veut dire donc qu'il faut investir beaucoup en avant.
Means that you have to invest a lot of money up front if you want to be sure that you will get the resources to allow your project to go ahead. So if you're lucky, as are the 2 municipalities you just mentioned, it's good because it gives an opportunity to get money from the federal, provincial, and territorial governments and from the municipality itself. But there's a lot of competition for these projects, so you have to invest a lot upfront to actually get a contract. Yes, and as you said, there's a huge infrastructure deficit, So if I understood correctly, unfortunately, the program, as it was announced by the federal government, is not going to help address that infrastructure gap. Can you tell us to what extent the gap will not be closed and whether the infrastructure deficit will increase? Well, there are no specific figures or information on how we can solve this infrastructure deficit. I think as it now stands, it's fairly stable because there are investments which are being made under the Economic Action Plan. This is good, but it's a short in time, this program. It is very important to know that there will be long-term investment. That is key. Investments such as the gas tax fund. And this is the best way to go about it because it's stable, it's long-term, it's predictable, and it's clear that the money will be coming in so you can do the math in advance. But for the municipal infrastructure gap, we need something similar to the gas tax fund. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kuti.
Follow up, Mr. Carlton, and perhaps not a question, but a few comments in terms of, I appreciate very much your comments here today in terms of the indexing of the permanent gas tax fund, which will add, as you mentioned, $9 billion over 20 years. I do want to compliment very much your work, your organization, Karen Leibovich, who comes from Edmonton, who's your current president and chair, for the work that you did with the finance department, their office, in terms of ensuring that this was in place well in advance of the other program ending in 2014. So I did want to compliment you publicly on that. Mr. Giorgetti, I did want to ask you, with respect to your comments, and you're one of the longest labor leaders in the country, one of the most respected across the country, and very intelligent guy. But so I'm going to see if I can get you to agree with me on this issue. To me, there is a fundamental distinction between a negotiation between a corporation and a union and a crown corporation and a union. Between a union and a corporation, the leadership represents the members. The corporation obviously has to answer to shareholders. I mean, you know, as experienced member, when you're sitting across the table from, say, TELUS or whoever, that they have to answer their shareholders and they have to find financing. And I mean, you have an interest, obviously, in them not going bankrupt because there's nowhere else they can go for funding. They have certain economic realities they have to deal with that you and your members are very much well aware of. So it's very much a two-party discussion, negotiation. With respect to a crown corporation, if you're sitting across, if you're Cup W, you're sitting across from the crown corporation, you know in the back of your mind that the taxpayers are the ones behind. So there is, in fact, another party, and as Mr. Charette pointed out, since 2008, taxpayers have contributed an additional $2.4 billion in bailout contributions to 8 of the 48 Crown plans. Despite the bailouts, the shortfall in these plans is now $4.7 billion. So, first of all, I mean, I'm not sure how people don't see the distinction between those two types of negotiations. And in the second type of negotiation, like, who is supposed to represent the taxpayers? Because it's not the Crown Corporation representing the taxpayers, and that's why the logic of having Treasury Board represent the taxpayers in those cases.
Okay. First of all, let's just make sure we put on the record that in all of these Crown corporations and in the public service, those people that you call employees make significant contributions from their own pay package to their pension plans. Absolutely. They too. So it's not just one side, it's them, and there's an issue of how the government. But in terms of the Crown corporations, they're accountable to Parliament already through the minister responsible. They get their mandate from a minister. The Treasury Board or your internal structures can give a mandate, or the minister can give a mandate, a wage mandate, to the Crown Corporation already. That's the way it happens now. What confuses us is it looks like there's a third party coming in called the Treasury Board. Does that take away the role of the minister responsible? Because that used to be where the mandate was given through the government through the taxpayer right now. Crowns have to undergo annual audits. Most have to submit corporate plans, operating budget, capital budgets for approval by their minister. That already exists. What confuses us is there now a third stage called Treasury Board who can overrule the minister or the mandate the minister gives. It's really confusing to us that happens. And the second and most relevant question to that, Mr. Rajat, is what's the problem now? Is if everyone's going to second-guess the collective agreements that sit there, sure, you can invent all sorts of problems like Mr. Charette does. But the fact of the matter is all of those settlements were made with the representative of the taxpayer at the table through their Crown Corporation.
Well, my time is running out, but the problem is you've had bailout contributions of $2.4 billion, with the 8 plans shortfall $4.7 billion. And in the case of Company A, I mean, they can't go to the taxpayer, whereas the Crown Corp is thereby backstopped by the taxpayer.
They go to the bank. So the Crown Corporation goes to, if they can't go to the government, then the Crown Corporation, then the Crown Corporation should go to the bank. They're entities. If they're a private employer for all intents and purposes. My employers that I've negotiated with, some of them have had to go to the bank to get some backstopping. General Motors had to come to the people of Canada for a while. There's all sorts of happenings that wasn't because of pension deficits. It's because the market failed the system. And now we have to go and look at ways to accommodate short-term. These Canada Pension returned 10% last year. A Crown Corporation, I might add, Mr. Jean. 10% they did, investing the people's money in pension reform.
Okay.
Okay?
My time's up. Unfortunately, I'd love to continue this debate, but I thank you for your responses. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, responding to our questions. If you have anything further for the committee, please submit it to the clerk. Colleagues, before you get up and wander around, we are going to move immediately to, we have 3 motions from the NDP and 2 budgets I'd like to deal with. And during that time, we are going to swap in the next panel. So I am going to, does everyone have a copy of the 3 motions? Okay. So we are going to start with the motion by Ms. Nash, and I will give the floor to Ms. Nash, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll just read the motion first. The motion is that the Standing Committee on Finance immediately undertake a study on the impact of Part 3, Division 17 of Bill C-60 on the independence of the Bank of Canada with respect to its setting of the nation's monetary policy and its economic research activities. In light of the discussion we've had today, Mr. Chair, our concern is that Part 3, Division 17 of Bill C-60 could undermine the independence of the Bank of Canada.
Sorry, order. Could we just have, could we have all conversations, please, taken outside? We are dealing with 3 motions, please. If you have conversations, please take them outside the room. Okay, thank you. Okay, Ms. Nash, you have the floor again.
Thank you. Our concern, as we have discussed today, is that Division 17 of Part 3 of Bill C-60 could undermine the independence of the Bank of Canada through the involvement of the Treasury Board and as a fundamental plank in all of our Crown corporations, but especially in our monetary policy and our economic research activities. We want to make sure that the independence of the Bank of Canada is assured, and we believe that it would be valuable for the Finance Committee to undertake such a study.
Ms. Nash, I will go to Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just going to make a general comment. I believe one of my colleagues would like to talk to this motion specifically. And my general comment is, of course, I think all members here recognize what a busy committee we have. I know that we go into our subcommittees. We work very, very hard to establish what is the agenda. And as we looked, we planned right into the fall. And so I guess I'm very, very surprised to see that the NDP continually puts forward these myriad of motions. These are issues that haven't come up within subcommittee, and of course we have planned our schedule. It's very, very busy. I'll let my colleague again speak specifically to the motion, but I guess I'm a little disappointed because I think within our subcommittee structure we try to be reasonable and fair and accommodate in a fair way the interests of all the different parties as we look at the studies that we're going to do.
Thank you. I have Mr. Caron, and I don't have anyone else, so someone else. Okay. Mr. Caron and Mr. Adler.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The motions presented here, like the previous ones, represent previous studies on issues which could have serious consequences. We're talking here about the possibility that a government bill could influence or unduly influence the independence of the Bank of Canada and in the following Canada on the policies of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. These are very important issues which should also be important to the government, since the independence of these organizations is a crucial parameter to the functioning of government and its organizations. So to say that we're too busy, we've got too much work, when presented with these important issues, for me, well, that's not serious. These are significant matters. They affect good governments, and that's why we're bringing them forward. They're not dilatory motions. They're motions of substance, which would lead to reviews of substance. So I would ask the government to understand how important it is to look at these matters. We're not asking for 8 meetings on these matters, but enough time to look at these specific aspects of Bill C-60. We're not the only ones to say this. Other organizations, such as the CBC, which is not even affected by these motions, but the Bank of Canada, if you listen to economists who have seen the potential impacts, they're concerned. If you look at what public policy and economic policy experts have said, well, they're concerned as well. So I think it's worth it for this committee to look at these matters. And since Bill C-60 was introduced not too long ago, now's the opportunity to study it more in depth. I certainly hope that the government sees that it is worthwhile to study these issues in the interest of good governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It never ceases to amaze me. The NDP comes forward these spurious motions consistently, and they know how tight our timetable is, and yet they consistently bring forward these motions. And this one really takes the cake, because they're asking for us to look at Part 3, Division 17 of the Bill C-60 on the independence of the Bank of Canada when it comes to setting monetary policy and doing economic research. But that's exactly what we are studying right now. We're doing it right now. So what they're asking us to do then is to, yes, study it now, but then study it again. And not only are they asking us to study it for a second time, but the first time around, they didn't even invite any witnesses to speak to their side. So we're going to reject this motion because it's redundant, and I would suggest that in bringing motions forward in the future, that the NDP take a closer look at what they're proposing, because as in this instance, we're clearly studying this right now. For the sake of not wasting any more of the committee's time, let's just reject this motion and move on, and hopefully the NDP not put forward any kind of fatuous motions in the future. It's ridiculous.
Okay, I have two more speakers. I'll just remind members we have 2 more motions. So I'll go to Ms. Nash, please.
Well, let me just address the objections raised by the Conservative members of the committee who have used some interesting words. Spurious and fatuous, I believe, were 2 of the adjectives. Well, back at you, team. I guess one could make that case with Division 17 of Part 3 in Bill C-60, where certainly I've had many constituents come to me expressing concern about the independence and the integrity of our Crown corporations. Surely a government that pretends to desire competence and expertise on economic matters would want to be assured that there is complete independence and integrity for our bank, the Bank of Canada. We didn't ask them to include these intrusions in Crown corporations in their budget. Of course, it was unanticipated when we set the schedule for the Finance Committee. We are reacting to both the inclusion of these provisions in Bill C-60, their latest omnibus budget bill, We're also reacting to the fact that there is so little time given this committee or any other committee to study the provisions of this bill. We believe that this is something that is fundamentally important to the integrity of our economic system, that we make sure that our Bank of Canada is fully independent. We need to reassure ourselves of that. And I would argue that if you look at our schedule carefully, which we have done, we have nothing planned for either the 11th or the 13th of next month. And in fact, we could very well accommodate a further examination of these very important issues. So I submit that in fact we do take the time, study this carefully, because I'm sure Canadians would not be happy if they found that their government had in some way compromised the integrity or independence of their bank, especially during these insecure economic times.
Okay, thank you. I have two more speakers, and I'd like to go to the vote if I could. Mr. Caron.
Very quickly. We've pointed out we have time to consider this. We have Bill C-60 before us. Some parts were sent to other committees that will be considering them in a rather superficial manner, so we'll be actually getting recommendations without any debate. We have two parts here, Part 1 and Part 2, and several divisions. There are several subdivisions that we have to consider, and these involve 15 to 20 laws in a few meetings. So don't tell us that we've had enough time to discuss this. It's a fundamental issue. It's fundamental to the whole financial and monetary system in Canada, and our committee is too busy, so we're not going to consider it. At some point in time, one has to take this issue seriously, and that's why I would encourage the government to adopt that motion and the following motion. My colleague pointed out that, in fact, we do have 2 days available on the 11th and the 13th of June, so there are days available for us to discuss some very important issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm glad we're moving to the vote after I speak. But, you know, the NDP, through their flummery, just loves to waste time. And time is the most valuable commodity we have as MPs around here, because we're involved here in the people's business. And we've also invited witnesses to be here today. And now not only is the NDP proposing to waste the committee's time, but they're proposing to waste the witnesses' time. And they came here at great expense of their own time and resources. And I would suggest that we just move to the vote so we can dispense with this as quickly as possible and not waste any more time.
Okay. No, this is on Ms. Nash's motion. So on Ms. Nash's motion, all in favor? I see 5. All those opposed? 6 are opposed. That motion is defeated. We will then move to Mr. Caron's motion. Second one I have.
It's a very similar motion. I'll read it. That the Standing Committee on Finance immediately undertake a study on the impact of Part 3, Division 17 of Bill C-60 on the independence of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board with respect to its mandate of achieving a maximum rate of return without undue risk of loss for the Canada Pension Plan. I won't put forward any other arguments. The arguments are the same and just as relevant as the ones that were put forward earlier. I do not understand the government's stubbornness in trying to avoid these issues. It's our responsibility to consider any major impact that legislation can or may have on the Canadian financial system. And to just simply deal with it by saying that it's not important seems to be the government's argument of the day. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't really sure. I looked at this because, of course, this is very similar to Mr. Adler's position, and that is that we're already studying exactly what he wants to study. And he had the opportunity to bring forward witnesses to testify and for him to ask questions, just like we have today, but they didn't bring them forward, so they wanted to study. And I couldn't figure out why that was the case, Mr. Chair, until I did a little digging. And my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the NDP are actually graded on the amount of motions they get passed in this place. They're graded by their party leadership. And I'm just thinking that, to myself, I'm interested in, for certain testimony, but we've already got a process in place for that testimony. And I don't think, and bluntly, Mr. Caron and the other NDP members could have asked for particular witnesses to come here today. They have that ability, and they could put it on the witness list, but they didn't do so, or the day in particular that we were studying that part of the Act. And I was wondering why, as I said, and they're doing it for party leadership and for their own self-promotion, and I think that's wrong, Mr. Chair, and I wasn't going to raise it as a point of order, but I certainly think it's something that we should consider in this committee in the future. If they're going to, compromise our work and indeed waste our time on the basis of their own self-promotion in their own party, I think that's uncalled for, and I don't think it's necessary. So I would certainly vote against this particular motion, and I hope my colleagues support me on that.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Caron and Mr. Bryson.
Je trouve ça absolument renversant.
It's quite shocking to see to what extent this government is refusing to accept the most basic principles of good governance. The government wants us to believe that we can deal with important issues with respect to the Bank of Canada's arm's-length nature and the Pension Plan Investment Bureau with simply 2.5 meetings mixed up with other witnesses who are very interesting in themselves and who have very interesting points to make, but who are speaking to different parts of the bill and who are referring to about a dozen different divisions in Part 3. We should have one witness here. Perhaps even if we'd had 4 or 5 or 6 meetings, then we could have heard all these people, including those from the Investment Bureau. But we have 2.5 meetings to deal with the bill that will be amending about 20 acts. So is the government... perhaps the government is casting doubt on the motivation that leads us to put forward these motions. But I would say we are doing it because the issue is arm's length, the arm's length nature of these organizations, and it deals with the whole financial system in Canada. All the Conservatives want to do is deal with this as quickly as possible, deal with any discussion as quickly as possible, given the amount of time that we've been given in committee. So we listen to testimony. We know perfectly well what the outcome is going to be. So are you actually serious as a government in dealing with these good governance principles? Do you actually want to accept those principles, work based on those principles without necessarily taking the time to actually consider what the ultimate impact will be?
I support the New Democrat motion, but to Mr. Jean's comments, if Mr. Jean has accused the New Democrats of engaging in self-promotion, and does this represent a fundamental shift in Conservative government policy? And if so, will they cut the economic action plan ads that are costing hundreds of millions of dollars of hard-earned Canadian tax dollars? That's perhaps for consideration. I'm just trying to be constructive.
Thank you. Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know what Mr. Bryson has against supporting Canadian media, but I would like to say that, just for the record, very quickly, Mr. Chair, I noticed that the New Democrats did not deny what I suggested. So I would suggest an A for effort and an F for result. I'd like to go to the vote.
Okay. We will then go to the vote on Mr. Caron's motion. All in favor? En faveur? I see 5. All opposed? I see 6. That motion is defeated. And we'll go to Mr. Rankin's motion.
In the interests of time, this is a very straightforward motion. It simply suggests that this committee invite the Auditor General and his officials to appear before the committee before the 11th of June to discuss Chapter 3, Status Report on Collecting Tax Debts, CRA, and the Auditor General's Spring 2013 update. Now, the committee will have received a letter from Mr. Ferguson dated May 6th, in which he seems to ask for the opportunity to speak. He says his staff and he would be pleased to come to the committee and meet us about the crucial issues that he points out in his status report. Among which is the uncollected tax debt increasing by 60% since 2006. It's risen from $18 billion to $29 billion, with 10% of the total tax debt written off each year. Mr. Chair, this would seem to be something worthy of the Finance Committee's attention. It seems self-evident if the Auditor General has something to talk to us about, we would want to hear him on such an enormously important issue. That's the reason for the motion.
Thank you. Ms. McLeod, please, on this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will leave the more general comments because I've made them already, but I think there's two important features to note. I think, the Auditor General made some, very valuable observations and recommendations, which of course we've moved ahead to implement. And I also want to acknowledge he acknowledged the important progress that the government had made on this very important issue in terms of having systems and processes, and so certainly I compare that with the 2006, and really, which was an unsatisfactory following the Liberal government, to what was a great movement and strides. But I think mostly it was interesting yesterday, my colleague who is the Parliamentary Secretary for the Treasury Board was quite puzzled by this. He said, the Auditor General was before public accounts on, I believe it was May 2nd. Certainly that was the opportunity, and I know our side, if there's, particular chapters, we ensure that the person that has an interest in those particular chapters actually participates in those meetings. So the Auditor General has appeared before public accounts. They had a very robust discussion. That was a great opportunity for Mr. Rankin if he had specific ideas, thoughts that he wanted to discuss at that time. So again, given both my more general comments, the great clarity of the report that the Auditor General's put out, we will not support this motion.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll go to the vote on this motion then. All those in favor of this motion? I see 5. All those opposed? 6. That motion is defeated. Colleagues, if I could, today, you do have 2 budget requests before you. First of all, for this study for Bill C-60, the amount requested is $26,500. That is approximately $10,000 less than what was initially sent to committee members, so it's less than what we had thought initially. So is there any questions or concerns? Okay, can I get someone to move this? So move, Mr. Jean. All in favor? Okay, that's passed. Thank you. And secondly, with respect to our study of Bill C-462, you did raise some concerns about the budget previously. It has been adjusted downward substantially. So any questions, concerns about this budget? Can I get a mover for this? Mr. Jean again, all in favor? Thank you, colleagues. All right. We will move then to our second panel. I want to thank our witnesses for being very patient, for dealing with the 3 motions and 2 budget items. We have, again, 6 people to present. We have, first of all, as an individual, we have Mr. George Smith, a fellow and adjunct professor from Queen's University. We have, representing the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, Ms. Judy Dezel. We have, from the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, we have the National Director, Ms. Diane Bergeron. From the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Monsieur Denis Bolduc, General Secretary. From the Canadian Urban Transit Association, Monsieur Patrick Leclerc, Vice-President. And by teleconference, and we have Monsieur Florian Sauvageau. Monsieur Sauvageau, can you hear me?
Oui, je vous entends très bien.
Yes, I can hear you perfectly well. And thank you.
To colleagues and to Mr. Sauvageau, you will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and we'll proceed in that order. And we will start with Mr. Smith, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the invitation to comment on Bill C-60 as it relates to industrial relations in Canada. My name is George Smith, and I'm a fellow in the School of Policy Studies and an adjunct professor in the School of Industrial Relations and the School of Business at Queen's University. Prior to joining Queen's in 2010, I had a 37-year career in Canadian business, practicing industrial relations as the chief management negotiator for Air Canada, Canadian Pacific Railway, and CBC Radio-Canada. I believe that I can offer you both the academic and practitioner points of view on the impact of these provisions of Bill C-60. My interest here today is not to represent any party which may be affected by the enactment of this legislation, but rather to outline the significant potential impacts of the proposed legislation on free collective bargaining in Canada. Please understand that I know about cost control in Crown corporations. I was part of the privatization of Air Canada, the revitalization of the Canadian railway industry, including CN as a Crown corporation,
and the modernization of CBC's collective agreement. But this involved tough bargaining, negotiating out what had been negotiated in to meet new competitive pressures. Free collective bargaining achieved these necessary changes. Was it easy? No. Did it work? Yes. As it relates to the legislation before us, I must first note this unilateral proposal to change collective bargaining in Canadian Crown corporations is the antithesis of my multiple previous experiences with legislative reform of industrial relations in the federal sector. Those previous experiences often involved tripartite consultation with all interested parties before changes to the Canada Labour Code were made by the government in power. These proposed amendments to the Financial Administration Act, buried in Bill C-60, contradict both the spirit and intent of the Canada Labour Code as articulated in its preamble and create a role for government in Crown corporation collective bargaining which is not contemplated in the Canada Labour Code. The preamble in part reads, "And whereas the Parliament of Canada desires to continue and extend its support to labour and management in their cooperative efforts to develop good relations and constructive collective bargaining practice, and deems the development of good industrial relations to be in the best interest of Canada in ensuring a just share of the fruits of progress to all." In my 4 decades of experience, the role of government in collective bargaining, the collective bargaining process, consistent with this preamble, has been to support positive bargaining outcomes through federal mediation and conciliation services. This proposed legislation contemplates an active role for government as a player in the collective bargaining process, approving mandates and supervising negotiations. Not only is this role contrary to the Canada Labour Code, but the adverse impact on collective bargaining will be significant. Unions will not know who the employer is if the government is controlling mandates in a back room. Governance processes at Crown corporations will surely be confused when CEOs and boards of directors have their powers to approve collective bargaining mandates superseded by Treasury Board. And the collective bargaining process itself will be negatively impacted by the unusual and unwanted presence of Treasury Board at the bargaining table. Relationships between labour and management, which are fragile at best during stressful negotiations, will be strained to the point of breaking, with the negative consequence of ensuring labour disputes. There will be costs to the economy. In sum, an already complex process will be complicated to the point where, in my considered professional opinion, it will become totally dysfunctional. Finally, my comments must be taken in the context of previous interventions of this government into industrial relations which are inconsistent with the Canada Labour Code as written. Since May 2011, there have been 5 instances of back-to-work legislation which have cumulatively threatened collective bargaining in Canada, including the right to strike or lockout. And I might add that substituting interest arbitration for the right to strike has not achieved the desired bargaining outcomes in most of these cases. The CEO of Air Canada recently declared his collective agreements uncompetitive as he launched another cost-cutting process. This heavy-handed ad hoc government intervention has become enough of a pattern that a proper policy debate of the potential reform to the Canada Labour Code is absolutely necessary. I urge you to consider the significant impact of these sections of Bill C-60 in this context and amend the bill. Alternatively, send these proposed amendments to the Human Resources Committee to review them in the context of the entire Canada Labour Code. Or, ideally, recommend the creation of a tripartite consultative process under the auspices of the Minister of Labour to review these and other potential amendments to the Canada Labour Code. The fundamental Canadian freedom of collective bargaining is being threatened. I submit that a full public policy debate is necessary before changes of this significance are made. Canadians deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. We'll go to Ms. Dezo, please.
Thank you for including the Association of Municipalities of Ontario in your study of Bill C-60. I would like to address Division 18 of the bill, which proposes indexing Canada's gas tax fund. AMO administers the gas tax fund to all municipalities in Ontario except Toronto. We distribute the fund twice a year on a per capita basis. Municipalities can count on this stable, predictable administration model and invest the fund where they need it the most. Our unique model has proven to deliver. Between 2005 and 2011, Ontario municipalities invested more than $2.1 billion gas tax dollars in over 3,800 projects. These projects have produced 3,900 kilometres of safer roads, 240 safer bridges, 230 additional transit buses added to municipal fleets, over 106,000 tonnes of waste diverted from Ontario landfills, and 136,000 metres of new and rehabilitated water, storm, and wastewater pipes, among many other positive outcomes. Canada's gas tax fund improves the lives of Ontarians by making our communities safer, more efficient, and prosperous. The fund has helped communities keep construction-related jobs in the face of economic uncertainty. In response, Ontario municipalities are transparent in reporting where they invest the fund and sharing project benefits with the community. The way the fund is administered in Ontario has proven to be effective, efficient, and accountable. A number of third-party evaluations have confirmed this fact. Despite the direct benefits of Canada's gas tax fund, it is no secret that Ontario's infrastructure is under pressure. Much of it was first built in the 1950s and 1960s, and it needs to be upgraded or replaced. In some Ontario communities, population growth is increasing the burden on local infrastructure and fueling demand for new investments. Other municipalities have lots of assets to maintain, but a shrinking population base and declining tax revenues. In 2008, the Joint Provincial Municipal Fiscal and Service Delivery Review determined that Ontario municipalities face a $60 billion infrastructure gap that will take 10 years to close. That means every community in Ontario needs $6 billion per year, every year, for 10 years. This is a gap in our core critical infrastructure, such as transit, water, wastewater, stormwater, solid waste, and roads and bridges. It does not include other key areas of municipal infrastructure like recreation, culture, and in Ontario, social housing. The infrastructure gap exists in all Ontario municipalities, no matter the size or location. While working to address this need, we are very pleased that Parliament made the gas tax fund permanent in 2011, and we are also pleased that Budget 2013 committed to expanding the list of eligible project categories and to index the fund starting in 2014-15. Expanding the list of project categories makes the fund even more flexible and allows municipalities to address the needs that are unique to their community. Division 18 of Bill C-60 seeks to implement indexing, and we applaud this. Indexing is absolutely essential so that the fund grows over time to meet inflation and rising construction costs. Indexing ensures that municipalities can rely on Canada's gas tax fund as a stable, predictable, and long-term source of funding to address the infrastructure gap felt in all communities. However, based on our understanding of the formula proposed in the bill, municipalities will have to wait before they experience the positive outcomes of indexation. The need for investment is now, not only because of the infrastructure gap, but because investment drives the economy of the future. Municipal infrastructure provides the support to social, cultural, and commercial activity that leads to a dynamic and prosperous Canadian economy. If we are correct, the formula is not changed, we ask that the government tell us how much in gas tax funds will be transferred now and in future years so that municipalities can plan for the long term. Predictability is one of the most important and welcome features of the gas tax fund. It is especially important in Ontario since municipalities are now working on long-term asset management plans. The plans consider how much it will cost to rehabilitate and replace infrastructure in order to meet desired service levels. Predictability is the key to implementing these plans since it ensures funding will be there when it is needed the most. We hope that the federal government considers the immediate need for safe, efficient, and sustainable communities when it implements gas tax fund indexing in Division 8 of Bill C-60.
Okay. We can just wrap up very briefly, please.
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good timing. We will now go to Ms. Bergeron, please, for your 5-minute opening presentation.
Thank you. Before I start, I would just like to explain how I'm going to do this presentation since I can't read print, hence the dog at my feet. I'm using a talking computer, so I have an earphone in my ear, and it will be reading out loud to me what I'm saying afterwards, so if I stumble, I apologize. On behalf of CNIB, I would like to thank the Minister of Finance, the Finance Committee, and the federal government for their, sorry, I got 2 earphones in, for their continued leadership in support of the development of equitable library services for Canadians with print disabilities as part of its 2013 Economic Action Plan. An estimated 10% of Canadians have a print disability, and only 7% of published works are available in alternate formats. Canadians with print disabilities include people who are blind or partially sighted like myself, people with impairments related to comprehension, and people who are unable to hold a book. For Canadians with print disabilities, access to reading material in alternative formats increases literacy, encourages lifelong learning, and improves opportunities for employment and community engagement. When I was doing my master's degree at Royal Roads University, I was required to do a proposal for a research project. I was excited to find a book written by a Canadian author called Seeing Beyond Blindness. This book was all about teaching and education of blind and partially sighted people from birth to grave. Interestingly, the book was not available in an alternate format. It took me 4 weeks to receive the book in an alternate format, 3 weeks after my paper was due. It significantly impacted my education. Access to materials in alternate formats improves quality of life for Canadians, seniors with print disabilities. It prolongs their ability to enjoy leisure reading and supports their social engagement. In Pigeon Lake, Alberta, not far from where I live, in Edmonton, there's a man named Gary. Gary is 80 years old and a good friend of mine. Pigeon Lake is not close to a city and there's no public transportation. Gary is totally blind, and although he uses a computer, downloading books is very difficult. Gary relies on receiving his books on DAISY format on a CD in order to listen to books, and that is his form of entertainment. Typically, once a week, somebody will go and pick Gary up and take him to town, but other than that, his main source of entertainment, leisure, and interaction is with the books that are provided to him with the DAISY player. The funding set aside in Bill C-60 will support CNIB's work with public libraries and the community leaders to progress towards the creation of a new organization, the National Digital Hub. This is independent of CNIB, and it will support public libraries in their delivery of equitable public library services. The funding will also allow CNIB to acquire and produce for the National Digital Hub over 105,000 additional alternate format materials in e-text, DAISY audio CD, and e-books to navigate digital material, and Braille. This new content through CNIB's Library Service Total Collection will be available to Canadians with print disabilities through public libraries, direct service points, and the web. Once again, we thank the Government of Canada for its leadership and commitment to improving access to library services to Canadians with print disabilities. in the 2013 Economic Action Plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bergeron. Ensuite,
Thank you. We now have Mr. Bolduc. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Standing Committee on Finance. Thank you for having us before you today. My name is Denis Bolduc, and I am the General Secretary of the CUPE in Quebec and the Regional Vice President. CUPE has 600,000 members throughout the country, but today I appear before you on behalf of the 2 unions that represent staff from the CBC Radio-Canada in Quebec and in Moncton. We have the local CUPE 675 that has represents 600 members and professionals, and also the French network, Radio-Canada Network, representing 1,200 workers. We have come to Ottawa in order to voice our strong opposition to the amendments being proposed to the Financial Administration Act in Division 17 in Bill C-60. Passing these new clauses would, in fact, do away with decades of Canadian democratic traditions, and it would disrupt labour relations within this country. The CUP cannot approve these changes as they threaten the very fundamental rights that we have, such as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and the right to free collective bargaining. Mr. Chairman, what is being proposed in Division 17 in Bill C-60, if it were to be passed, would allow the government to interfere in Crown Corporation collective bargaining. Through an order in Council, Treasury Board would be able to give negotiation mandates to Crown corporations. It could send observers to sit in on meetings, to impose working conditions, and even to prevent the signing of collective agreements that it may not agree with. This is clearly runs counter to freedom of association as we know it in Canada. As you know, these freedoms are covered by the Canada Labour Code that defines the employer as the person who hires the workers. Therefore, it is with the employer that unions should be negotiating, and of course in good faith. However, what the government is proposing through Bill C-60 is to provide collective bargaining to a third party, the Treasury Board, which would absolutely change the rules of the game. It would increase litigation, and it would harm good labour relations. As a member of the International Labour Organization, Canada has committed to respecting and promoting the fundamental right to collective bargaining. That is why we call on you to withdraw the amendments being proposed to the Financial Administration Act in Bill C-60. Now, beyond collective bargaining, in the case of Radio-Canada, Bill C-60 is in conflict with the Broadcasting Act. The Act is very clear. It states that the CBC shall, in the pursuit of its objects and in the exercise of its powers, enjoy freedom of expression and journalistic, creative, and programming independence. Radio-Canada's board has a great amount of independence. It can hire the staff it feels is necessary for the running of its operations. It can determine salary and employment conditions. It can even purchase equipment without asking permission to whomever, including government representative at the negotiating table, would set a dangerous precedent that would undermine the independence of this Crown Corporation and would open the door to political interference in journalism in this country. Without independence, freedom of expression is restricted, and we can no longer speak of a public broadcaster, but rather of a state broadcaster. This is not what Canadians wanted. They want information provided by journalists who are free to investigate topics of their choice. No government should have any control over a broadcaster as important as Radio-Canada, CBC. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right that is enshrined in the Charter. The arm's-length nature of Radio-Canada CBC has to absolutely be preserved. A public broadcaster should not become a propaganda tool in the hands of a government, regardless of the government in power. This is a fundamental principle, and that is another reason to reject government interference that is being proposed in Bill C-60 in terms of the management and programming of CBC Radio-Canada. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the CUPE has doubts about the reason why the government is proposing this legislative change. Is there a problem that needs to be solved? If so, it has not been described and should be. For now, all we see is an underhanded attack against workers in Crown corporations and throughout the Canadian public. Bill C-60, in fact, changes constitutional legislation of Crown corporations by withdrawing their ability to negotiate. It disrupts the public broadcaster in particular and sends them into the camp of broadcasters controlled by the state. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your opening remarks. We'll now move on to Mr. Leclerc. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to begin by thanking you for the invitation to appear before the Standing Committee today on Bill C-60 to implement the federal budget that was tabled last March. The Canadian Urban Transit Association represents approximately 500 members of the public transit system, including manufacturers, suppliers, government agencies, research centres, and several other stakeholders in this sector. In the month of March last, the federal government delivered on its commitment to develop a new infrastructure plan, a long-term infrastructure plan, by replacing the Building Canada plan, which will end in 2014. The CUTA has worked together with the government and various stakeholders in the funding of infrastructures throughout the process and throughout consultation.
Critical elements we were looking for. It had to be long-term, and it had to include public transit as a central pillar. We were pleased to see that the new Building Canada plan meets these two criteria. The long-term nature of this plan, a 10-year funding commitment, is the basis of good and long-term urban planning. In our sector, public transit projects are years in the making, and providing stability and predictability for future investment is extremely important. We commend the government for such a strong commitment. The other important factor was to ensure public transit is at the core of the new plan. In that regard, the government built on the strength of the previous plan and went even further by making transit an eligible category for funding under every single program in the new plan. Au cours des semaines et des mois à venir,
over the next few weeks and months, the government will be able to count on our cooperation in crafting the various criteria required for implementing this plan. It's very important now to define the most efficient ways to ensure adequate funding for communities of all sizes throughout the country. We must ensure that all Canadians, whether they live in major urban centres or in small communities, all have access to public transit choices and other alternatives. The last point is on the increase in the gas tax fund. As announced in the budget, the federal government will be increasing that by $1.8 billion over 10 years. Those increases will happen in amounts of $100 million and will be calculated based on Division 18 of Part 3 of Bill C-60.
And to ensure the fund will maintain its actual value over the years and will keep up with the inflation. As stated in the Economic Action Plan 2013, presented by the Minister of Finance, it is proposed that the GTF be increased by 2% annually, with increases to be applied in 100 million increments. We applaud the government for this improvement, and we agree with the proposal to increase the GTF by 2% annually. Based on our experience, we believe the most effective way to ensure the GTF keeps up with the inflation over the long term is to fully apply the 2% annual increase instead of applying it in 100 million increments. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci.
Thank you for your presentation. Now we will go to Mr. Sauvageau pour votre présentation. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 5 minutes, sir. Yes. Hello, and thank you for inviting me. And my presentation will also be on Section 17 of Part 3 of the bill. More specifically, on the inclusion of the CBC in the context of collective bargaining and the participation of Treasury Board. In my opinion, that part of the bill is an important violation and a deplorable violation of the principle of media independence, which is one of the basic principles of public broadcasting. I could perhaps briefly explain why I'm speaking to this issue. I'm interested in this subject matter. I've been interested in these issues for many years now, as some of you, well, the older ones maybe might remember. I was the co-chair with Gerald Kaplan of the last group which completely reviewed the issue of broadcasting in Canada. We had the task force on broadcasting policy. So it is in that spirit that I decided to speak to your committee today. So we have a choice between a state broadcaster and a public broadcaster. Since the 1930s in Canada, and I might remind you that it was a conservative government at the time which chose to have a public broadcaster based on the British model and based on the fundamental principle of an arm's length relationship. The provisions of the bill undermine the arm's length principle. This principle was reaffirmed by all governments and in all legislation since 1930, the 1958 Act, the 1968 Act, and the last one, all again upheld by a conservative government, the 1991 Act, which reaffirmed this principle of a public broadcaster and the principle of this arm's length relationship. Now, if we want the term independence to mean anything, it also has to mean the independence of the management of human and material resources. Of course, this independence does not mean the public broadcaster is not accountable, but the public broadcaster is not accountable to the government of the day. It is accountable to Parliament, and there are many mechanisms. There are enough mechanisms today to provide for this accountability. There's the CRTC, and the Heritage Committee of the House of Commons, which hold the public broadcaster to account. We also have the Auditor General, which conducts very serious audits, quality audits. And in fact, I was part of 2 of these audits, and I can assure you that these audits are of very high quality. So, if the committee would like to know more about what a public broadcaster is and what makes it different from a state broadcaster, and this also applies to radio, of course, at our media study center, we produced a document which this came out 10 years ago, and it was translated into several languages. We presented this report to UNESCO, and many of the former East Bloc countries which wanted to transition from state broadcasting to public broadcasting referred to this document, and if the committee wishes, I can forward a copy of it to you. So at the time, Canadian expertise was recognized by other countries, and of course our system is not perfect, but many people throughout the world turn towards Canada, look to Canada when it comes to creating a public broadcaster, and we mustn't lose this. And I repeat, what is being proposed here, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, is unacceptable because it undermines the independence of Radio-Canada, of the CBC, and it is essential for the future of our democratic life that these provisions be repealed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your presentation. We will now begin with Ms. Nash, please, for 5 minutes.
Good morning to all of the witnesses. Thank you for being here. Bienvenue. Mr. Smith, I want to address my questions to you this morning. I know you have a long history of representing management in collective bargaining, 4 decades, as you said in your remarks. and that you have great respect for the democratic process that collective bargaining represents. I'm wondering, do you think it's possible that those who have written these proposed changes that would have the Treasury Board intervening directly in collective bargaining in Crown corporations, do you think it's possible that those who are proposing this don't really understand the collective bargaining process and therefore don't understand the potential impact of the changes that they are proposing here?
I think that's entirely possible. It's one of the reasons why I believe we need to have practitioners in the room discussing the potential impact, short-term, long-term, of the kinds of proposals that are being proposed. And I refer back to those consultative processes which have been used by previous governments, Conservative and Liberal, that use such processes so that the people who would actually be impacted, the people who are at the bargaining tables, have input and can provide the real-life stories from those bargaining tables of the kinds of potential impacts of the changes that are being proposed. Mm-hmm. So I'm concerned that these changes are being made in isolation. I'm sure there's a backstory that maybe we don't know about, but that's the problem with them being presented in isolation and not having an opportunity to fully discuss them and their potential impacts. I also find it completely unusual. I've never discussed potential impacts on collective bargaining in front of a standing finance committee. Normally this would be in front of the Human Resources Committee or a task force that had been commissioned by the government, by the Minister of Labour, and it would be in that forum with people for whom this is their life and their daily business. It would be among that group that those conversations would be taking place. So this is an unusual first time in almost 40 years that I make representations in front of a committee such as this.
Well, welcome to the Finance Committee, where we discuss navigable waters, CSIS, the RCMP, anything that gets thrown into one of these omnibus budget bills. So, yeah, welcome to the new world here. I know that in my discussions with business and also my history in collective bargaining, that business really wants predictability and stability, when they negotiate a collective agreement, it's so that they will have that predictability and stability going out, and that the agreement that they freely negotiate is the best one to suit the conditions, the business conditions that a company is dealing with. And I have to say, I find it ironic that a government that professes to oppose big government has taken such a big brother approach to our Crown corporations and especially to collective bargaining. Can you describe, based on your management experience in collective bargaining, what could be some potential outcomes to what is now a fairly stable labor relations environment if these changes that are being proposed in Bill C-60 should come into place?
About 30 seconds for a response.
Yes, sir. Collective bargaining is messy. Sometimes it causes inconvenience. Labor disputes, I would argue, are short-term pain for long-term gain. But the product of a freely negotiated collective agreement is an agreement that both sides agree to and both sides then commit to implement. And that gives management the certainty, it gives the employees and the union certainty in the business environment. It doesn't mean that those negotiations aren't difficult, but mandated change, in my experience, with wherever it comes from, doesn't work. You cannot force unions and employees, and I'm speaking as a management negotiator now, to accept changes unless they have input and understanding as to why the changes are being made and what the implication of those changes will be for them. If that's done properly, you can achieve it. It takes time. It's messy. Sometimes it involves disputes, but it's a much better way than mandating change.
Thank you.
Mandated change doesn't work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Chair. And certainly it sounds to some degree we're carrying on some of the conversations that we had with the previous panel. And what I would really like to make comment on, first of all, is Mr. Bolduc, you said, what problem are we trying to solve? And I think, again, in the last panel, we talked about $88 million in supplementary estimates having to go to Via Rail in terms of their pension plan. Our chair talked about the larger number in terms of billions of dollars of unfunded pensions. One of the examples in terms of perhaps an agreement in a contract, so Canada Post collective agreement with CUP-W includes a clause that CUP-W members cannot be laid off. If an employee's position becomes surplus for whatever reason, Canada Post must redeploy that employee within 40 kilometers of their previous job or pay them to sit at home until a job becomes available. You know, certainly I've been, in my community, the mill just shut down. It was very, very difficult. 125 people lost their jobs. There's still 300, luckily. They kept the beeline going. But those people had to look for other alternatives. I recognize it's very tough. I've been involved in the healthcare industry where, there's changes in the structure of our institutions. And changes had to be made within the structure of the labor market. So I guess, Mr. Bolduc, within your organization, do you guarantee a job for every employee at the head office forever, regardless if there's work for them to do?
Well, I'm not a representative of Canada Post. I don't represent those workers. However, in general, when there are specific requests or demands related to cutbacks of budgets and positions, this happens at the negotiating table, and the people at the table are best positions to understand the impact of those cuts. It's the people who are on the ground. It's the people who are living in the workplace every day. However, this bill, what it does is that it withdraws the agency of these people by injecting Treasury Board through these provisions. It's a problem.
Respect. What you asked is, what is a problem with some of the independent negotiations of, the Crown corporations? And to me, this particular example speaks to the issue, the taxpayers that we're ultimately responsible for. I don't think any reasonable Canadian supports that particular amendment. And so again, I think what I've given is an example of what is a huge issue. But I do actually at this point want to head to Ms. Bergeron. Certainly, I really appreciate you coming here today. I think maybe most of the MPs at this table and probably across the country had constituents come into their office to talk about the digital hub for your organization. Certainly, I met with two community members in Kamloops, and so one of the, of course, pleasures as a parliamentarian is we see what is a need and see it come from presentations to committee, presentations in MP offices into a reality in the budget. So could you talk a little bit, I know you talked to some degree about what you're going to accomplish with this digital hub. I think Canadians would be interested to hear a lot more in terms of the details of what this will actually do for community members.
Okay, there's about 1 minute for a response, Ms. Bergeron.
I'm going to actually ask Margaret McGorry is our librarian at CNIB, and I think she can probably articulate it better if that's okay.
Okay. With respect to your question about how the funds will be used for this project, there are two main objectives. One is to advance the project to take the library for people with print disabilities out of the charitable sector that relies on donations for the services, and put it where it belongs, in the public library sector. So part of the funding will be to work with public library leadership to effect that transition over the next year. The other part, the major part of the funding will of course be to run the operation of the CNIB library and the hub that is internally incubating within the CNIB at this time. So it will produce alternative format material, as Ms. Bergeron explained. We have a collection of about 80,000 alternative format books, digital, braille, etc. This will add a further 105,000 books to our collection. So it will allow us to produce that collection. It will also allow us to distribute the books to people who are blind and partially sighted throughout the country.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Bryson for your round, please.
I'd like to begin with not only to thank the CNIB for being here and for their presentation, but to thank them for their service to Canadians. And it's not until you have a member of your own family directly engage with the CNIB and receive services from the CNIB that you fully appreciate and understand the importance of the CNIB. And just on behalf of all Canadians, thank you for your remarkable service to people like my Aunt Margie in Cheveree, Nova Scotia, who, because of macular degeneration, could no longer read without the equipment you provide her and the materials you provide her, and it means so much to our family. I want to ask Professor Smith a question about labor relations in Canada. In 2010, for instance, were labor relations bad in Canada? Were there was there significant unrest and in not just on the business side or on the government side? Are labor relations somehow turbulent and problematic in Canada?
Labor relations tend to be cyclical, and relationships with unions and management in a general sense have their peaks and valleys. 2010 was not particularly remarkable. As I recall, in fact, many agreements are achieved under the radar. It's the ones that where there's some sort of dispute that get the attention, and it's a disproportionate amount of attention.
So compared to other industrialized countries, would the state of labor relations in Canada be considered reasonably good if you're looking as businesses, if you're looking at Canada, pretty stable?
Yes.
So the question is, why is the government so hell-bent on making these changes? It reminds me of the saying, if it ain't broke, fix it until it is broke. You've cited how many examples since May of 2011 of government decisions that threaten labor relations broadly?
Well, there are 5 instances of intervention. 3 at Air Canada, 1 at Canada Post, and 1 at Canadian Pacific Railway.
Good labor relations, would you agree, is good for the business environment?
I would agree with that.
So do you see these changes as being bad for business?
Yes. They're bad for both parties and the employees, the third party. And
bad for jobs, bad for the creation of jobs as such, bad for the investment climate as well?
There's an interesting irony here in the sense that the government intervention has been justified because of the economic recovery. I believe that was a misguided belief, that actually by letting free collective bargaining work, you actually protect jobs and you protect industries. And it may well be, as Ms. Nash suggested, that even though this was well-intentioned, it hadn't been thought out. And so what we now have is short-term gain for long-term pain instead of the opposite. And I'm at a loss because we've never had a chance to debate it as to why that has become the it's a permanent exceptionalism now that exists.
There have been references made to the previous government in 1991 and the Broadcasting Act, the Canadian Broadcasting Act. I would please, and I'm doing this constructively, but I would urge witnesses not to call that a Conservative government. That was a progressive Conservative government, and there are significant differences, as we're seeing evidence of. One question I have is the BBC model has been cited in terms of public broadcasting. In the UK, is their governance consistent with what the governance has been in terms of labour relations? Is there a Treasury board person participating in these kinds of negotiations?
Not to my knowledge. From my experience at CBC, they operate independently.
So BBC is the same. It is the model that has been previously or up until now the case.
Yeah, they have their own labor relations challenges, but it is independent within that corporation.
Okay.
Okay. You've got 5 seconds. So.
Thank you very much to each of our witnesses.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Mr. Van Kesteren, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you all for coming here this morning. I want to direct my question, Mr. Smith. I just want to ask you, or actually, I'm sure you're aware of this. The Quebec provincial government has maintained a law since 1985 entitled an act respecting the process of negotiation of collective agreements in the public and para-public sector. This law requires all provincial crown corporations to seek ministerial approval. Can you tell me what the difference is between that and C60? And C60, which you called unprecedented in a CBC report.
My presentation is done in the context of the federal labor code in the federal sector.
Would you agree, though, it's about the same thing?
Well, sorry?
Would you agree it's the same thing?
I have no knowledge of the situation in Quebec. Okay. That's not my expertise. It might be interesting just to see,
because in Quebec, with crown corporations, once an agreement is formulated, it needs ministerial approval. So it's not unprecedented.
I know a lot more about the structure of
that's fair, but
corporations
I think it might be something just in the future.
Unions.
And I'd love to keep going with you, but it was actually, Mr. Leclerc, on your, you said in a press report that that the budget involves essentially no additional funding and actually reduces an overall spending in future years as part of a plan to get back to balanced budgets. Did I say Mr. Leclerc? I'm sorry, Mr. Bolduc. Mr. Bolduc, I'm sorry. I hope you got your listening ears on. It was actually you that said that there's no additional funding. And actually, I think as a conservative, I think that's a good thing. I think we may disagree, but I think that's a good thing. And would you disagree that our plan falls out of line of a balanced budget? Is that something that you think is something that we shouldn't be doing? I'm talking about additional funds, sir. That you made criticism that there are no additional funds.
I don't know if it's the interpretation, but with regard to the additional funding, what exactly do you mean?
You were critical that the budget has no additional funds. And I was just stating that as a conservative, I think that's something, you don't remember making that quote? Your organization?
Oh, you're not talking about today's presentation specifically.
You might have changed your mind.
No, not at all. But basically what we're saying is that the government, regardless whether it's a Liberal or a Conservative government, the government gives a general mandate. So it gives a budget to each Crown corporation. Once that's been decided, whether a budget goes up or down, because we're going through that right now at Radio-Canada. So after that, it's up to the local managers to negotiate on behalf of the organization.
I'm not getting cross. I guess my question is, do you think it's important that we balance our budget? The government balances the budget.
It's not an objective that we have to reach in the short term. Tomorrow morning, I don't think it's it's good to have that as an obsession. What we need to do, what the government needs to do, is to take measures to make sure that we have the biggest middle class possible in a context which respects the law. At this, right here, we're talking about changing the law which would allow the government to interfere in the negotiating process. So,
At limited time, and so you're saying that you don't think it's necessary too quickly. I think that's what it's not something that we have to achieve immediately. The reason I'm saying that, because on your web page, somebody in your group as well, this is a quote: "Economies around the world have weakened significantly because of misguided austerity. In Europe, Greece's economy has gone from bad to worse with successive austerity measures imposed in exchange for EU IMF loans and a renegotiation of the debt." Does QB believe that the problems in Greece had nothing to do with out-of-control public spending and excessive generous benefits to the public sector? Is that what I gather from that? Just very quickly.
Yeah, it's a big question for Monsieur Leduc. Leduc, vous avez...
Mr. Leduc, please, a very brief reply. In fact, what we're saying is that we need a healthy management of public financing, but this obsession with reaching budget balance at any cost is not something we should focus on every day. We need to manage our public monies well. The example of Greece is not like the example of Canada. Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I just want to follow up on Mr. Van Kesteren's question, put it to Mr. Smith. In Quebec, the difference is that there is no Treasury Board rep at the negotiating table beside management, so that's very different. I have a question for Mr. Sauvageau. Sir, I'm very pleased to speak with you. You are well known in the area of communications, and in fact, when I was studying in the 1980s at the University of Laval, I was thinking of taking one of your classes. Oh, you didn't? No, I went to Ottawa U. Sir, you talked about the arm's length principle, which is really important for specific Crown corporations. Understand that since the last election, we asked 2 questions with regard, amongst other things, via rail and Canada Post, and every time the government said it could not provide any information because the questions had to do with internal operations of a Crown corporation, because it was an arm's length corporation. Mr. James Moore in committee also said that the CBC was an arm's length organization, that is, the government would not interfere with internal operations, including human resources. But now we have a measure which, despite what the government has said in the past, will breach this arm's length principle. Is that what you're saying? Absolutely. These provisions will undermine that principle, and there will be several consequences. First, it'll undermine Radio-Canada or the CBC's independence in the eyes of the public, and secondly, it'll undermine the perception people have, and this is important, of the Canadian broadcasting system in the eyes of people abroad. Even last week, a colleague who has obtained Canadian citizenship but of Tunisian origin was named the chair of the Tunisian equivalent of the CRTC. Whom did this person turn to find an ideal model for an independent public broadcaster in Tunisia? Well, this person turned to the Canadian embassy, turned to Canada, towards the CRTC. So in the eyes of people abroad, Canada has always had an independent public broadcaster, and it's something I defended at UNESCO at the beginning of the 1980s. We were pointed to as a model country, as a country able to find a way to come down right in the middle. So on the one hand, not too much interference from government, and we based our own model on the BBC. And so our public broadcaster does have an arm's length relationship. Some of your colleagues referred to the BBC, and the BBC still functions very well. The BBC has the equivalent of a board, the CBC's board. So the BBC has a trust, which is a very credible organization, and it's a good model for us. The other thing I'd like to say is that the end does not always justify the means. So good management, healthy management of public finances is a very laudable objective. Everyone agrees with the good management of public finances. That said, in order to achieve that, you cannot take means which would undermine the independence of our institutions and of our democratic values. Another question, Mr. Sauvageau, with regard to Mr. Flaherty's testimony before this committee yesterday. We asked him a question. We said, Mr. Minister, what if a journalist was working on a story which displeased the government? Could this journalist be targeted and suffer consequences? It might be an extreme example, but it remains that the Minister of Finance said that Canada is not a dictatorship and that we need not worry about that. Without talking about a dictatorship, do you think that the provisions of Bill C-60 might have a chill effect on journalists who are covering government, and would it encourage them to pull back a little bit? Well, as you said, let's not exaggerate. Let's not talk about dictatorships. However, on the other hand, you might know that more and more journalists today don't have job security at Radio-Canada or the CBC, and there is a chilling effect which does affect journalists who don't have stable jobs. For instance, freelance journalists. I'm not saying that it will happen, but these freelancers, for instance, might self-censor because they want their contracts to be renewed, and they don't have the job security of unionized reporters. And so under the bill, Treasury Board can dictate the rules of non-unionized employees or contract workers as well. Thank you very much, Sauvageau. Thank you very much. We're running out of time. Thank you very much. Mr. Adler, please. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Bergeron, I want to ask you a question. And I have to first of all compliment you on your choice of service dog, a golden retriever. We have 2 golden retrievers at home, and they're fabulous dogs. So congratulations on your choice. I would like to ask you, we as a committee a few months ago undertook a study on charitable giving, charitable donations. And what we found, one of the findings of our analysis was that we needed to develop more of a culture of giving in this country. And in response to that, in Economic Action Plan 2013, the Minister of Finance proposed to create a first-time donors super credit. How important is that initiative for organizations like the CNIB?
I have to admit that the fund development area within CNIB is not my area, but I have to say that from the perspective of someone who has a child living an adult child in my home who is a first-time donor, I think it's very significant. The more money that gets transferred into charitable organizations from the public, the more ability we have to provide the enhanced services and the value-added services that we need to provide over and above the rights that Canadians have through the public service for rehabilitation services, library services, and employment services. So I think it's very significant. Anything that can help us to do the work that we do in the community that is focused on those value adds, I think is very important.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Ms. Dezel and Mr. Leclerc, I want to ask you both the same question, and we could start with you, Ms. Dezel. We took the gas tax fund. Number one, we made it permanent. Second, we indexed it. That is having the effect of, number one, laying the foundation for a competitive economy through the development of our cities. But second, and more importantly, it creates permanent and sustainable funding for our cities, which is so desperately needed right now. Could you comment on how important that initiative was for our government to undertake, and how important that is for, specifically, in your case, cities?
Thank you for the question. So my context is only within the province of Ontario, where we deliver the program, and it's been extremely critical to us. In Ontario, we only have one program for infrastructure that exists on a permanent basis, and that is Canada's Gas Tax Fund.
Yeah. Mr. Leclerc, could you comment on that, please?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's an extremely important measure. As we mentioned, the predictability and stability are two criteria that are really, really important for urban planning and transit projects as well. And when you look at the kind of the national picture in Canada since 2006, it's over $2 billion from the gas tax fund that went to public transit. And what it means concretely, it means that, for instance, in Edmonton, the gas tax fund is going directly to the extension of its south LRT, which means better and more service to the population. It also means for smaller communities like Whitehorse, for instance. Whitehorse has a 100% fully accessible bus fleet, and that was made possible through the support as well from the gas tax fund. So it's extremely important for our sector.
Yeah. Ms. Dezel, the below grade infrastructure in urban centers, some of it's very old and needs to be replaced. This funding, I suspect, will go a long way to helping to replace that much-needed infrastructure below grade, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. There's a demand for infrastructure investments across the broad range of spectrum, as I mentioned, in the core critical infrastructure and as well in those day-to-day things that Canadians enjoy in terms of skating on ice rinks and swimming in swimming pools. There's a need in every sector of the infrastructure category that municipalities administer.
Yeah, so it's really not just what we see in cities, it's also what we don't see that needs attention.
Absolutely. I would agree with that.
Yeah. How much time do I have left, Chair?
Seconds.
Oh, so I'd ask both of you, what would you say to those members of the House that would not vote in favor of this budget?
I'll leave that to you.
Thanks a lot.
Would you implore them to vote in favor?
I implore them to recognize that in order for the Canadian economy to be competitive, we need municipalities that work from sea to sea, and that includes having infrastructure that is new and safe and reliable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Adler. Mr. Rankin, please, for your round.
Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I guess my comments will be focused on Professor Smith and Mr. Bolduc, if I may, initially. I think it's just quite extraordinary. We have a very seasoned management representative and a very seasoned trade union representative united, which happens very rarely in my world, in saying that this particular move is regressive. You both expressed grave concerns with C60. I mean, we're talking about 48 Crown corporations employing 88,000 Canadian workers, and you're both saying that there's problems. And in fact, Professor Smith, you started by talking about the possibility of this initiative being contrary to the Canadian Labour Code, and two other legal issues arose. Mr. Bolduc reminded us of the fact that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees free association and has been held to include collective bargaining. So we've got a legal challenge potentially under the Labour Code. We've got a constitutional potential, and the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, who were here earlier, with a very respected media lawyer, Brian McLeod-Rogers, indicating an inherent conflict, as he called it, between the Broadcasting Act and Bill C-60, likely leading to legal challenges. So I'd ask the two of you, any thoughts of how these legal challenges may play out? Any predictions as to how this might proceed?
Okay. La Charte canadienne.
The Canadian Charter establishes the basic values of this country, freedoms, of which there is freedom of expression, freedom of religion, which are equal. After that, there is freedom of association and freedom of negotiation, which falls under that. So these are values which the Canadian state and Canadians themselves have given themselves. I think that the government must promote these values of justice and fairness and equality. And the government is the first one to have to promote these values and not put obstacles in the way of their expression. The government should make it easier for people to aspire to these freedoms. However, in the bill, it says that Treasury Board can reject any agreement negotiated between managers and the unions. The bill also says that Treasury Board is not the employer. So just in that regard, because of these two measures, we believe that the issue will be carried before the courts, which will lead to a massive waste of time and money.
I'm concerned that these changes are being looked at as sort of it's a binary decision. Either we accept the changes that are proposed in this Act, or we can't have efficient Crown corporations who negotiate responsibly. And my purpose of pointing out that the Canada Labour Code is potentially in violation is I believe that under the Canada Labour Code, without these changes, you can have efficient collective bargaining that address the kind of concerns that have been put on the table that Ms. McLeod identified, because those changes have been made. CN and CP Rail both had employment security for all their employees, not just in a 40-mile radius. And in 1995, we negotiated those changes to the collective agreement. CN went on to be privatized, and CP, as you know, is going through a revitalization now. It was done through collective bargaining, and it was done under the Canada Labour Code. So my intent is not to suggest launching a legal challenge, is to move that conversation back to the forum of the Canada Labour Code and recognize that historically the Canada Labour Code has provided a framework within which the kind of changes that are being proposed here can be undertaken.
Thank you very much. This is a question for Mr. Sauvageau, if I could. You termed the broadcast, the changes that are implemented would be implemented by Bill C-60 as unacceptable, and then you spoke in another answer to a question about how this would undermine the perception of independence of Radio-Canada and CBC in the eyes of the public. I guess I'd like you to speak a little bit more about that, specifically provide a little clarity about what these changes would do. The fact that the Treasury Board could now change the bargaining mandate of the Radio-Canada. How do you think that would undermine that perception of independence that we've enjoyed to date?
We will not have the feeling anymore that it is a public television, because its independence, as I said at the beginning of my intervention, is one of the basic principles of any public television. There is no public television without independence. Yesterday, I quickly went over again some questions which were asked by the BBC. The BBC is the model for public television, which served as our inspiration. And again, in their case, they say that the management of resources is the job of the Director General. And there has to be a buffer, and this buffer is the BBC Trust. If directives for collective bargaining, rather, these directives have to come from the board of the CBC and not from government. The government has to remain at an arm's length from public TV.
Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Carrying on where Mr. Rankin left off, Mr. Savagnin, are you familiar with CTV and Sun Media?
Si je connais quoi?
CT. Can you repeat that, please? Oh, yes, of course, I know them. I know these two broadcasters, yes.
Broadcasters?
CTV, Sun Media, no.
CTV, yes. Sun Media, no. I don't get Sun Media on cable TV in Quebec. CTV, yes. I watch the French stations, but I'll often watch.
I'm in Quebec also. I have a home in Quebec because I stay there. I get it. It's channel 179, Sun Media. You might want to check it out. I think it is, or 79 actually. I just want to ask you, do you think that Sun Media and CTV operate independently from the Government of Canada? Maybe if you had a chance to watch them recently, you would think so.
The CRTC guarantees their independence because the CRTC is independent of government. If there was no CRTC, they would not be independent.
Is that we have a situation where the independence of broadcasters can be guaranteed by regulation. It doesn't have to be guaranteed by funding. But I do have this question for you, sir. The Royal Charter in the United Kingdom, BBC, that enables the BBC, they fund principally the BBC on an annual license fee, which is charged to all British households. In fact, I think last year, households, corporations, and organizations, I think it was about 134 British pounds last year. And it's set annually by the British government. And in fact, it's voted on by Parliament every year to approve or not approve that funding licensing mechanism. Is that what you're suggesting we should do, is send a bill out to every household in Canada for $160, $180?
I believe that the license fee system is surely a good one, and many European countries use that system, but it would be impossible to implement it here in Canada because it's not part of our culture. People would object, and they would be completely against that kind of system. I don't think it's possible.
I pay a licensing fee now. It's called cable. I pay cable now in Quebec, and I pay about $120 a month. And I get, for that, I get CTV and Sun and CBC. Isn't it possible to amend our licensing fee system for CBC and allow people to have the independence to decide what channels they want to pay for and what channels they don't want to pay for? Don't you think that's a fair way to do it, sir? Because right now we don't pay CTV anything. The taxpayers don't pay them anything, and I watch them, quite frankly, more than CBC. And Sun Media I don't watch more, but I do watch them, and they obviously act independently now. Don't you think that's possible, sir?
I think you're confusing public television and commercial television. In Canada, there are different types of TV, 3 different types of broadcasting, public, private, and communities. They have different financing models. You're comparing apples and oranges, sir.
I think a user should pay for what they want to watch, and I don't think that I should have to pay for other people to watch something I don't want to. But I want to go on to Mr. Leclerc, if I may, please, sir. How long have you been with the Canadian Urban Transit Association?
Personally, been for 3 years with UDI.
And you're familiar with the file generally, the urban transit file? And do you work with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities as well?
We work closely together, yes.
Very closely. In fact, isn't it fair to say that most of the time in your dealings and with government that you work together collaboratively to try to put forward and lobby for your position on most things?
Yes, we do collaborate on a regular basis.
Now, are you familiar with what took place in Toronto with ridership, and that ridership went up as a result of this government's implementation of a tax credit? Are you familiar with that?
We know that the ridership is going up in Toronto, for sure.
And I know that I have talked to members of your association before, and they believe it's a direct correlation to the tax credit implemented by this government some years ago. Would you agree with that?
The tax credit is one of the measures that is favoring and rewarding good behavior in taking public transit.
It's a good system, isn't it? It's working well.
It is working for those who are using public transit, for sure.
And wouldn't you agree that this government has taken great steps in relation to the tax fund, making it permanent, the gas tax fund making it permanent, doubling it, and indexing it? Do you find that to be great news for your organization?
Last question.
It is an important one, for sure.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jean. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here this morning, your patience and responding to our questions. If you have anything further to submit, please do so through the clerk. We will ensure all members get it. Merci beaucoup à tous. Meeting adjourned.